How do you even start with this? I have loved video games for so long. I've also loved kind of discussing different topics and educating people on different things and trying to get the discussion going with them in a mature type of environment, something where we can actually discuss things. And as of the past year, I've really had a huge infatuation when it comes to video game design, the psychology behind it, why certain decisions are made, what we've learned from it, what seems like a good idea ends up not being a good idea, and everything like that. And after learning these things, it's really made gaming just completely different for me. It makes it so I can enjoy it in a completely different way, and I want to share that with other people. And this was also a fantastic opportunity to go back and play certain games that I missed over the years that are very important, that were, landmark titles. So I thought doing this series would be a great idea, a great way to do this. I have gone through and researched Metroid, the series, the franchise, the history behind it, and also the game itself, the development, the process of it. And I'm happy and excited to discuss this with people. However, this is my first time doing this. This is the first video in this series. Hopefully, this goes for a decent while. And I going to be winging it a little bit. While I do have a guideline to go along while reading this, this is still I've done no types of training when it comes to teaching, educating, speaking in front of public audiences. In a professional manner, fostering discussion, everything like that. So this is definitely going to be a bit rough around the edges. And hopefully it goes well, but I plan on learning and improving as time goes on. So if anyone has any feedback or ideas on how I can improve that in the future, I would absolutely love that type of feedback. So, I'm trying to think of anything else to get with. These defense, obviously, perfect. Just give me the rubric and I'll be more than happy to give that. I'm trying to think if there's anything else really to bring up before we actually start this discussion. I still don't have a set in stone name for this series that I want to do. Kind of toying with the idea of design of play, I think works really well. I also like backbone of play or backbone of design as other ideas. But as of right now, I'm sticking with design of play, and that might change. One more thing to talk about. This is obviously this whole discussion is something I plan on saving and uploading onto YouTube and also Twitch uploads. There's going to be used for Twitch uploads now. I plan on saving this, so because I'm gonna kind of try to treat this as almost like an informal type of recording. I'm going to try to obviously have the discussion with chat, not have the typical idle conversation that I do have with chat in response to regular conversation. I'm going to try to focus this to almost in a format that could be comparable to a YouTube video, I guess. So that's definitely going to be a little bit out of norm for what I do on the channel. But that's really all I can think of. Oh, you know what? I also meant to do one more thing. I'm glad I remember this beforehand, before we got the discussion going. I want to turn off all notifications. No, that's wrong. Follows disabled, subscriptions disabled, everything. I just want to keep it entirely focused on the discussion at hand. All right. I think that should be good. I can't really think of anything else. Anyone have anything that they want to say before we actually get started on the discussion and the topic at hand of Metroid Prime? I'm going to be having a little this at the top of the screen to go along with the so everyone knows specifically what it is, the topic that we're going to be talking about. Ah, yes, all very good points. Thank you for bringing those up. All right. No, again, like this whole thing is supposed to be equal parts discussion and equal parts educational. If someone has any questions that they want to ask relating to the development of the game, that relates to game development in general, feel free to ask if I am educated on the subject. I am more than happy to give my 2 cents on it. If you are someone who wants to ask a question about something that I said, my opinion on something, feel free to go for it. This is meant to be as much a discussion as it is an informal educational video, I guess. So feel free to take part in it. I just want to say, like I said, this is going to be more of a format that's supposed to be kind of comparable to a YouTube video than a live stream. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Just don't think I'm ignoring you, or don't feel like you shouldn't ask those questions, or don't think that you should be taking hints about not asking questions if I don't respond to it. It's a very difficult balance, and I'm kind of trying to learn with this whole thing. Okay. I think we're good to go. And the volume is still good. It's ambient noise in the background. It's not intrusive. It's not loud and something that takes precedence over my voice. Well, the song's very quiet, but basically, if that is the case, I would very much like you guys to let me know if the audio gets a little bit loud or intrusive over what I'm trying to say. If it's no longer background noise, becomes foreground noise, or equal to my voice. So. Makes us fine. Okay. I guess we'll get this started. So, I just finished playing through Metroid Prime, and I decided to start with Metroid Prime first, specifically because my channel, my community was mostly fostered and based around Nintendo games, and knowing that I wanted to do the series where I play through many different landmark and influential games throughout history, while Nintendo is definitely a big player in that type of making games, there are plenty of other games out there that have nothing to do with Nintendo or the type of games that they do create. So things like Half-Life or Bioshock and things like that would be quite a stark contrast going from Nintendo right into those games. So I felt like Metroid Prime was a fantastic transition point from Nintendo into something a little more different, being that it's a more darker tone. It's kind of an outlier when it comes to different Nintendo IPs. It's a shooter as well on top of that, so I thought it would be a great transition point. And of course, it's also Metroid, one of Nintendo's really big IPs, and it was their first jump into 3D. And there's definitely a lot to be learned when it comes from a series that moved in from 2D to 3D, but in the time period where 3D was becoming a thing. Nowadays, if there's a game that releases in the year 2020 and it starts as a 2D game, making the transition if a future game goes into 3D, well, it can still be difficult because the game is built around 2D, and people kind of get their ideas of what the experience they're going to get from the game is based on 2D. It can be difficult to go to 3D. There's a lot more examples of 3D games now in the current day to know what we can do, what we can't do, what we should do, what we shouldn't do. So Metroid Prime is a fantastic example of that type of transition period where we were still going into 3D. Even though it came out on the GameCube, we did have the entire Nintendo 64 generation. A lot of that experimentation phase had kind of come and gone by. Yes, if you're going to mention the similarities between Metroid and the Alien franchise, yes, I will actually. Very briefly, not too in-depth, but yes, I actually will be bringing that up. So before I actually go into Metroid Prime itself, I decided to do a little bit of research on Metroid itself. Again, since this is discussing the transition from 2D to 3D, it's important to discuss the 2D elements and the games that first came out in 2D. So, Metroid is one of Nintendo's first early major IPs. I always thought of Metroid as being one of their later entries, but it's actually came after Mario, DK, and Zelda, and that's pretty much it. Metroid's kind of like their fourth major IP, really. I was shocked to find out that Metroid had predated the F-Zero series. It predated any releases for the Star Fox series, for the Mother series, for the Fire Emblem series, for the Kid Icarus series. It is a much older IP. It came out in 1986, shortly after Zelda came out. And you can definitely see the influence with its release period, because Metroid is essentially a combination of Mario and Zelda into one different game, because Mario is all about the platforming, where Zelda is all about the adventuring. And Metroid, that's pretty much the entire basis of the game. You're platforming to get everywhere throughout the entire planet of Zebes. Now we're going to call it Zebes. But you're also adventuring, you're getting different items and upgrades to fight different enemies in different ways and things like that. It shares a birth year with Zelda. Yep, I actually just kind of assumed that the original Zelda came out in 1985, because that's, I feel like, the big boom of video games. That's when Nintendo started to really save the video game industry. But no, Zelda actually came out in 1986. I was very surprised by that too. That's also an interesting point, Electric. I feel like growing up, I mean, I was a big Nintendo fan, so I knew all about Mario and Zelda. It was all over the place. Nintendo constantly advertised it because those were their two big babies, their big IPs. Metroid was left in the shadows, and I guess it was left in the shadow of Zelda specifically. I never knew that because anytime I guess there was a anniversary or special event date for Zelda, it would also be for Metroid, but they probably didn't want to take anything away from Zelda since that's the big moneymaker and the thing that more people are familiar with. I didn't think about that. Okay. So, while Metroid was a combination of Mario and Zelda, it was still a very groundbreaking series. Now, I want to preface this by saying console and PC games were so different at this point. They're still pretty different now, but they were really, really different at that point because of the input devices. You still had the mouse and keyboard for computer, but for controllers, for console, you had the D-pad, the A button, the B button, the start and select. That was it. That was all you could do for input devices. So while we have now in current days made it, we now understand how we can get more. One, we've updated the console, the controllers to have a much more ergonomic fit, but with access to more buttons. We've also figured out different tricks and different ways to get more mileage out of each of these individual buttons. So now we can have control schemes on PC that could usually work with console pretty well in most cases. Back then, it was near impossible. It was incredibly difficult to get games on PC, on console. So it was pretty much, it was very, very few similarities between the two. So when I say games on console were groundbreaking, that might not be the case in gaming as a whole. I didn't really do a whole lot of research when it comes to the discussion of PC gaming. I didn't really do a whole lot of research. I do know that when I speak about this, I did a ton of research into console gaming, so I am confident when I say that Metroid Series was groundbreaking. It was on console. Probably didn't do as well as they wanted, so they put more focus on Zelda and other games. Yes and no. Metroid did very well, the original ones. Once Prime came out, it started to shift quite a bit in terms of how the sales were, but I will be getting into that later. But that could play an impact for sure. After I had Fusion from year to year after it came out and played some, but I didn't really dig into it and gain love for the series until 2014. Fusion was the one that came out days before Prime, right? I also did not do a ton of research into that, which I probably should have, just considering they were released within days of each other and they had some minor connectivity across each other, but I haven't done a lot of research into Fusion specifically. And that's unfortunate that Zelda got Skyward Sword and Metroid got Other M. Oh, I didn't realize that. The same day? I thought it was within days of each other. But anyway, back to Metroid Prime. It was a very groundbreaking game when it came out. So a lot of different games, the main motivation behind games, besides money, was usually to create a sense of an adventure, a sense of empowerment, traveling off to distant places. And most people wanted to go somewhere fun, they wanted to go somewhere exciting, they wanted to go somewhere colorful, adventurous, things like that. Metroid was very, very different at the time, where it took place in a very isolated planet. You were completely alone. It had a very overbearing feeling where you are traveling through this planet on what's essentially foreign territory, where no matter where you go, something is trying to kill you. You don't have comms to communicate with other people. When you die, you don't have someone who's screaming out for the fact that you've died. You have no NPCs that you talk to. There's no safe places where you interact with other people. You are completely alone and isolated in this game, which was very, very different in the gaming landscape at the time. And part of this was heavily influenced, as you said earlier, Levy, by the 1979 film Alien, with Ripley, the scientist who's on the spaceship, who's being chased by the xenomorph or hunted down by the xenomorph. And it had a very similar feeling where she was completely alone. She had no communication. She wasn't with other people to help her out. There was no power in numbers. She was completely isolated, alone, her against this unknown alien force. And yeah, and Ridley probably had some strong connections to the Xenomorph as well. But I can't remember, the director of Metroid has said they drew quite a bit of influence from it, from the 1979 film Alien. So Metroid was very, very different in terms of its atmosphere that it set up, compared to other video games at the time, especially those by Nintendo. Something that was also pretty new for Metroid was permanent upgrades. So you think of Mario, where you get a fire flower, where you have that ability, but once you get hit, you take a hit from an enemy, you lose that upgrade, you regress back. When you get the Starman upgrade, you are invincible for a short time, eventually you regress back to your normal state. Most games at that time, upgrades were temporary. They were something that could be taken away from you. There were a few examples of things that didn't do that had more permanent upgrades, like Zelda did get the bow and arrow and the boomerang. Yes, the boomerang was in the original Zelda, bombs and things like that. So they were something like that, but permanent upgrades for Zelda were much more integrated into the game, much more tied to progression. They were means of different ways to defeat different enemies. There was so much more put into the upgrade system that the fact that they were permanent upgrades was wildly different at the time. Ridley's actually named after the director, Ridley Scott, but presumably his name went to the protagonist of the series as well. Interesting. Wow, a lot more connections to it than I thought. Another thing that the Metroid series did that was very new and unique to it was multiple endings. Back in the time period, games were... They had a lot of limited storage space on the hardware. They could not make incredibly long games to make it so that people and customers felt like they got their money's worth for purchasing these games. They had to make the games incredibly difficult just to stretch out the playtime for it. So the fact that you could get to an ending and complete a game was a big enough success and achievement in itself. The idea of having multiple endings was a wild one. And the original Metroid actually had 5 different endings, which was crazy. And also, endings 3, 4, and 5 had the twist reveal that Samus was actually female. So that's another huge thing that Metroid did back in that time period. It was understood that gaming, and I say understood, that gaming was a hobby that was just for boys, entirely for boys, that girls didn't really enjoy it. So when different developers were creating games or publishers were funding for games, they did not want to create female characters because boys didn't want to play as a yucky girl, so why would they do that? Every single character was almost always a male character in a game. So the fact that Samus, this hardened, really cool, badass bounty hunter traveling through the planet, gunning enemies down, in this horribly hostile environment, the fact that the twist response at the end, the reveal is that Samus was actually a girl, was absolutely mind-blowing. And Nintendo went the extra mile with this because they, in the instruction manual for Metroid, they actually refer to Metroid as a him, go with him on his adventure, things like that. So Nintendo was working hard to actually make this reveal big too. The reveal was so much of a big twist that apparently, this is purely anecdotal, but apparently lots of different people, when they played through the game and the reveal happened, the reveal is at the end of the game, the suit comes off and you see her with her long flowing hair and her bikini. Good old 80s. A lot of people responded with, who is that? They couldn't even fathom the idea that Samus was actually a girl. They were just confused as to what was happening on screen, essentially. First major female protagonist ever, disregarding Miss Pac-Man. Yeah. That was actually, Miss Pac-Man was because there was some kind of market for females out there and they want to get them in as well by making the character a female. And they pretty much had no major reason to not do it because the fact it was a female was just a bow on the head. I think that was it. It was a very minor thing. It wasn't a story-oriented game. Obviously, Pac-Man's super not story-oriented. So it was very simple and very easy for them to pull off. Progressive for the 80s. So what else? Oh, of course, what was hugely groundbreaking for Metroid that we still see to this day is Metroid is half the influence for an entire subgenre of video games called the Metroidvania. So Metroid makes up the one half. More specifically, Super Metroid is the game that's referred to heavily when people are talking about it. but obviously the starting point is Metroid. The other half is Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which came out in 1997. So original Metroid came out in 1986, Super Metroid came out in 1994, and Symphony of the Night came out in 1997. The story behind Symphony of the Night, just a quick little tangent. Apparently, the Castlevania series had been making multiple different games over the years. I believe the first one came out in 89. I could be wrong on that. It might be 87. But the multiple entries in the series had come out over the years. And eventually, the director of the series came in one day after he had seen that multiple copies of the most recent Castlevania game were found in a bargain bin at his local store. And he was upset about that and felt that people were just getting bored of the same thing over and over. So he wanted to reinvent the series. Castlevania Symphony of the Night came out in 1997, probably started development as a result in 1995 or 1996. Super Metroid had come out in 1994 and was getting rave reviews and huge positive reception that he decided he wanted to create another Castlevania game in the style of Super Metroid. Game was very polished, very well received. People absolutely loved it. So we have Super Metroid and Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Those two games were so iconic in establishing the rule set that they did that it created its own subgenre of games. And this is huge. This is very important because if it were not for Super Metroid, at some point we would have definitely gotten a game that attempted a similar type of playstyle. We would have had someone who had the idea of a progression-based system where you need to get upgrades that allow you to backtrack and get to new areas. But if Metroid had not done it, we don't know how far down the line someone else would have tried it. And if they had tried it, we don't know if it would have been as clean or successful as it was. And so if it weren't for Metroid, who knows how much further down the line it would have taken before we started getting the games that we did. And if it weren't for Metroid's release, we absolutely would not have, or would not have for years to come. We wouldn't have games like Hollow Knight, Ori and the Blind Forest, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, Axiom Verge, the Shantae games, Guacamelee, Owlboy, Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night, and Dead Cells, just to name a couple of them. These are huge games. Almost all of them are so important in their own right, but they are wildly successful, either critically, wildly successful in fan reception. Some of them are just wildly successful in general, like Hollow Knight and Ori and the Blind Forest, incredibly successful. So because of Metroid's entry and their first attempt at really making the new groundbreaking progression system that they did, we would not have the genre and all these different games that we have today. Castlevania was a month and a half afterwards? I could have sworn it was about 2 years after. I thought it was You're right. It was 1986. You are absolutely right. Wow, I thought it was 87. Huh. I was way off on that one. So that's most of the major groundbreaking things that Metroid itself had on the industry when it first came out. Afterwards, talking about Metroid in a 3D space, we never got Metroid on a Nintendo 64. We never got Nintendo 64 games. And that was apparently because Miyamoto said in a discussion that they had planned, they had brainstormed and thought of different ideas, but they couldn't think of anything that really stuck with them, something that they could build a game around. Nothing concrete enough. So they entirely skipped it. And it was probably a good call in the end because they didn't have to worry about Metroid going through that awkward puberty phase where they're understanding and learning how 3D works. You know, Mario 64, a fantastic game, but God, that camera was so frustrating. Still is to this day. Ocarina of Time, highly influential. Majora's Mask, my favorite Zelda game. Oh my God, their combat systems are so jank and frustrate me to no end when I still play them. Metroid had the luck to skip over this odd transition area and let others do the transitioning and the testing as well. Another huge benefit to skipping over an entire generation like this is it skips an entire generation of hardware. It gets to 2 generations ahead, much stronger hardware, which can have obviously completely different games, games with higher fidelity, can have just so much more in it, so much more storage space, more things going on in it at a time, which is fantastic. And also the controller. I don't think people realize just how much controllers changed in such a short period, because they look at it now, they look at the Xbox controller, and we have the it feels like it hasn't changed. You look at the Xbox One controller, and it's like the same as the Xbox 360 controller, almost indistinguishable from it, except for minor aesthetic changes. But functionally, it's pretty much the same. Same thing with the PlayStation controller. You have the PlayStation 3 controller and the PlayStation 2 are pretty much identical, except for the bar on the top. Controllers haven't really evolved a ton as of recent years. In the period between 1985 and 2002, it's absolutely crazy how much they changed. This gives completely different types of inputs. This makes it so much easier to do multiple inputs or inputs shortly after one another. The introduction of the analog stick from just the D-pad alone is groundbreaking. So by skipping this entire generation, while the N64 did have an analog stick, it was still, that was the only pretty much form of movement. They didn't have access to two sticks. They didn't have access to the stick and the D-pad and things like that. So skipping over gave them an entirely new controller, an entire generation of testing and finagling with new control schemes. Now, the downside to this, of skipping an entire generation, we had Metroid came out in 1986. We had Metroid 2, the Game Boy Color game, which came out in 1991, I believe. And we had Super Metroid come out in 1994. So over the course of 8 years, we had 3 games. And then we go between 1996 and 2002. We have another 6 years where there's no games. People loved Metroid. The first 3 games were raved about, and they sold decently well. They had some complications at the times of their release when it came to different types of hardware. I very briefly saw this in my research, and I probably should have done a little more research on it, but something to do with a different type of storage and a different model of the Famicom and the NES made it so some of them were incompatible with each other. So Metroid's production was kind of, the original Metroid is split between what's essentially 2 different hardwares that have trouble reading on each other. So Metroid sold still very well, but could have sold a lot better. Game Boy on the Metroid on the Game Boy Color sold decently well. Super Metroid also had an interesting issue at its time of release where it didn't sell as well as it could have. But the Metroid series was well loved and people wanted more. When you have a 6-year period, you have an entire console cycle where there is no games, you kind of get that Half-Life 3 effect. You get the detox effect. That's a hip-hop reference. I don't know if anyone gets that. But you build up this desire for something. You start building up this idea of what it's going to be, that they're taking so long to create it. It's been so long since we've heard anything. It's clearly got to be good, that it sets up these expectations that people create. It makes it incredibly difficult to live up to those expectations. So while Nintendo had the upside, they had the positives of having new generations of consoles that are stronger and give the player more control for what they can do, they also have to live up to the expectations that is built over those 6 years. So it's not all just, completely positive stuff. All right. So now that's a little bit of background series on Metroid itself. Is there anything anyone else wants to bring up before we move on to the next subject? I honestly do think Metroid Prime will... I think it's possible it can come out in 2022. I would be surprised if Metroid Prime didn't come out by the end of 2023. That's also very true, Electric. I completely forgot about that. Samus did appear in Super Smash Bros. 64. That's a good point. It kind of reminded a lot of people that she existed, or people who did not know who she was were made aware of her existence, possibly played her games, and expected something else to come out. That's a good point. 2022? I don't think we would have a new console by 2022. Switch came out in 2017, I think. 5-year life cycle, it's possible, but with how the Wii U did not sell very well and how successful the Switch has been. 2023, maybe. I think once we get to 2024, we're starting to get in the window where it can happen. And I do know that the last generation that we had, the Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3 was a very weird generation where I think it lasted for 8 years. That is very not typical. Most generations are around 3 to 4 or 4 to 5 years. But I think things might be changing a little bit. Halfway through its cycle. Cool. 8 years, I'd be totally fine with that. All right. Metroid game trying to work on N64. I couldn't imagine it either, but we'll get into obviously the different wild things that Metroid Prime did on the GameCube, the different obstacles they had to overcome. And trust me, the idea of a Metroid Prime game, the way that it was on the GameCube, sounds like how the hell could they ever pull this off? Given the landscape of gaming. Same exact thing with GameCube. The company has also want more tiered approaches. Yes, it seems Xbox is probably going that direction where they're going for the tiered approach, where maybe you might be able to upgrade your console. It basically becomes a easier form of PC building. That's where you can upgrade your console to work even better, or work even stronger, work even faster with slight upgrades. All right. Okay, so we've given a little bit of background, a little bit of discussion, information about Metroid, the series itself, its original release, and the impact, the major focal points of the series itself, its design. So let's talk about the games that came out near and around the release of Metroid Prime leading up to it. So looking at the actual console, the Nintendo console, the GameCube, looking at the list of games that came out the year leading up to Metroid Prime, we had Super Mario Sunshine, we had Star Fox Adventures, Pikmin, Animal Crossing, Mario Party 4, Ty the Tasmanian Tiger, and Super Monkey Ball. Afterwards, games that came out shortly afterwards or in the year following, major titles I could find were Wind Waker and Mario Kart Double Dash. If you look at this list of games, this is a list of what you basically, typically, and stereotypically assume Nintendo is going to make. Colorful, happy-go-lucky, positive, feel-good, bubblegum and rainbows type of games. I mean, yes, Mario Sunshine is Mario gets locked up or accused of a crime that he did not commit, but he gets to go to every tropical location everyone could ever imagine, basically vacation, and go on fun adventures. Yes, Pikmin is, typical nature is metal, but the creatures are incredibly cute. The world is very colorful, and it's not a very, besides the Water Wraith, which was only in Pikmin 2, not even in Pikmin 1, it was still a very whimsical type of carefree adventure that I like to picture. All the other games, I'm not very familiar with Star Fox Adventures. I could be completely wrong with that. But all these other games, like Animal Crossing and Super Monkey Ball, I mean, these are just positive games all around. Mario Party 4 is, Nintendo describes it as a positive game. I mean, a lot of people got welts on the side of their head from controllers thrown at them. But the atmosphere is the point I'm trying to make. Much more positive atmospheres. Basically, the idea of a Metroid game with its dark, looming isolation presence seems completely contradictory to what Nintendo was making, because it was. And you would think that the player base and the install base that Nintendo had built up over the years in releasing games like this would be completely averse and not want anything to do with a game like Metroid and the atmosphere that it has. But, very important thing to know is that when Wind Waker came out, its announcement and its release had tons of backlash, and the reason is Nintendo released a tech demo for the GameCube where they showcased what they could do, and they decided to do that tech demo with Zelda. This was a much more gritty, edgy, dark type of tech demo that showed Link in a more dark atmosphere and location. People were very, very excited. People who grew up with Link and grew up with Zelda felt that the series was growing up with them and becoming more adult. Once they actually got the release for a new Zelda game, it ended up being Wind Waker. There was a lot of backlash. They felt like the rug was pulled out from underneath them, where we go from this dark and gritty adventure to something that is much more, child-friendly. A game made for babbies and babies and stuff. So eventually, once people played the game, they enjoyed it, realized it was a good game. But the important thing to note is that on the Nintendo hardware, the install base, people who played Nintendo games, there was a demand for this type of game, this type of atmosphere. This wasn't as much of a gamble as some people might think. So looking at other games that's not made just by Nintendo, games that came out on other consoles, I looked at a small list of games that came out in the year leading up to Metroid Prime. And some of the big sellers were Grand Theft Auto Vice City, Kingdom Hearts, Resident Evil, and Ratchet and Clank. Capture one shot. See what if anyone said anything. Yeah, Metroid is incredibly different from the list of games. GameCube era was a weird time. You can't leave this tropical island, take this water pump. It's just typical Nintendo, man. Very outside of the box thinking, which has worked very well for them. Sonic Adventures 2. Yep. Didn't even think about that. Important to know that Eternal Darkness, I have not even heard of this. The lists that I looked up were usually big sellers or big names or positive, well-received games, which I think leads into something that the executives would look at when trying to decide if they're going to greenlight a game. They would look at the fact that it's all those types of games, very positive, happy types of games. So I feel like the idea of making a game like Metroid Prime would be kind of a difficult sell given the environment of gaming at the time. It's a psychological horror game, one of like the 4 M-rated games on the GameCube. Interesting. Oh, is that the game that has the really weird effects where like your character has sanity, and as things go and your sanity goes down or things mess up, you have like different effects where like your game will randomly reset, or you'll like blue screen and have like it like breaks the fourth wall and things like that? Yep, that game is interesting. That game in itself should have its own different episode. That game is really wild. But the fact that it didn't sell well kind of leads into the argument that it probably was a very difficult game to sell to the executives for them to greenlight. But we'll get more into that. So looking at the list of other games that came out besides that came out on other consoles besides Nintendo, we have Grand Theft Auto Vice City, Kingdom Hearts, Resident Evil, and Ratchet and Clank, to name a couple of them. So there are definitely some darker games. Resident Evil is basically pioneered the genre of survival horror, even though it was heavily influenced by Metroid, and Metroid could argue to be one of the original first horror type games. It was very difficult to pull off horror at that time because of the sheer limitations of console gaming and gaming in general. But Resident Evil is definitely a dark game, the original survival horror. Yeah, Kingdom Hearts, that while it was, you know, goofy and happy-go-lucky at times, could also be a little bit edgy, so a little bit darker in theme. Grand Theft Auto, dark in a different sense, I guess, especially for the time period that it came out in. But there was a market overall for people wanting more mature themes or less kid-friendly themes and kid-safe themes. Just people didn't expect it to be on the Nintendo console. Other thing to look at with these is that almost none of these were really platformers. Kingdom Hearts had some platforming. Ratchet and Clank was a platformer, but it was also a third-person platformer. And, of course, Grand Theft Auto, clearly a shooter. Resident Evil was also a shooter, but these were third-person shooters. Metroid Prime was very, very different in the sense that it was a first-person platformer and a first-person shooter. This was pretty much unheard of, each of these genres on their own. Well, first-person shooters are very common on PC because of their input devices being different with the mouse and the keyboard. But in terms of console, first-person shooters were a dime a dozen. They were very, very uncommon. And first-person platformers, pretty much unheard of. So the games leading up to Metroid Prime's release, it was the type of game that Metroid Prime and the Metroid series was in general, seemed like something that would fit better on every console except for Nintendo. Between the games that were released for Nintendo and the games that were released for other consoles, it seemed like it would fit so much better. And of course, leading up to it, it was pretty groundbreaking in the genres that it wanted to approach. But I do want to take a second and have a detour where we talk about FPSs on console in the first place, because this is very important. As I said, FPSs were incredibly uncommon on console because of their limited control schemes. Turok was, I think, first person, and it was also made by Retro. That's true. Retro was swooped up by Nintendo. They had a contract where they were making 5 games for Nintendo, and they were going through a bit of development hell. They were approached by Nintendo to make 5 games because of the success of the Turok franchise, and they were given a contract to make 5 different games, and things were not going well. So Miyamoto stepped in to go and look at it, see the projects, and see if he can give constructive feedback and everything. And 4 of the 5 games he just did not like. He didn't really see any redeemable quality in it. There was a 5th game that was just codename title Action Adventure that he really, really liked. He saw a lot of potential in, and actually pitched the idea that it should be a Metroid game. He said it would fit perfect in the Metroid universe. And so he pitched it to the Nintendo execs. They said okay, and Retro pretty much dropped everything to focus exclusively on this game to eventually become the Metroid Prime series, the Metroid Prime games and the Metroid Prime series as a whole. Kind of funny how they were just another studio that was just had a contract to make a couple games with Nintendo, and 4 out of the 5 games they had zero interest in. One of them apparently looked good, so good that they wanted to take one of Nintendo's core IPs and make a game out of it. This was also unheard of. Nintendo was and still is extremely protective of their IPs, but this was insane. It was also a Western company. So much about the situation almost reads like a Mad Lib. You would never expect it to happen, ever. GoldenEye Perfect Dark. There's Perfect Dark is another one. I don't really discuss it because it's pretty much just a spiritual successor to GoldenEye. But there's 5 games in general we'll briefly be touching on. So, FPSs, very common in PC. As I've said multiple times, the control scheme allows for it a lot better. Older consoles did not have input devices they could do. A lot of them were stuck with just D-pads. Once we got to the N64, we started seeing a couple more because they had the analog stick, which allowed more movement, but that's still really only one input directional device. So to create shooters, a lot of different devs had to create different shortcuts or different ways to make it work. So pretty much the golden standard of shooters is GoldenEye. This game sold well, beloved by many, and it did a pretty good job of transitioning and creating a shooter on first-person on a console at the time with only one analog stick. To make it work, they had to tweak some things, create some shortcuts. So when you were moving around, you could see if there was an enemy. Obviously, if there's an enemy directly in front of you, you pull the trigger, you shoot the button, the bullet hits them and kills them. If there was an enemy just slightly off, you would actually see the gun rotate and aim towards the character to indicate to the player it's aiming at the character off to the side right there and would shoot. So you didn't really have to be super precise. You had to be facing in the general direction, and the game would help aim for you a little bit. Also, I believe this was the first game on console that registered extra damage for headshots, which was interesting. But you could take advantage of this by holding the right button, the R button, and it would make a crosshairs appear on the screen, and you could aim specifically where you want to for certain weapons. But it basically, to make it work, they had to give a general area that you had to shoot at, as opposed to being very precise. Another thing that they had to do was they made it so there was just very much less enemies that you had to deal with and encounter, because it could be very overwhelming to deal with multiple people shooting you at one time, and you had very limited control on who it is that you were shooting at. They just decreased the number of enemies that you would encounter. I don't know if this was an intentional thing. This could have just been, it could have been a hardware limitation that benefited them in the end. Could have been a hardware limitation that just happened to benefit them and they weren't aware of it. Could have been intentional, I'm not sure. But the AI could be tricked very easily. Ooh, that's a loud one. Did not expect that to come in there. With AI, they were very easily manipulated. You could go somewhere, fire, draw their attention, and they would aggro and come after you. You could hide behind a corner, and once they turn the corner, you gun them down and kill them. So there were certain things that made it enjoyable and made it much more manageable for console, but GoldenEye was pretty much the standard when it came to shooters on console that people looked to for influence or for what to do and what not to do. Another game that came out, GoldenEye came out in 1997. Another game that came out in 1998 was Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six. So this one was very interesting. Most of the challenge in the gameplay came from before the actual mission started. So the game would work, you would have a giant grid that would show, it was a blueprint essentially, that would show the entire layout of the level that you were going to be playing. Hold on. Also note, you're referring to Resident Evil 1, the GameCube remake. That confused me, and that's confusing to say now because Resident Evil got remade. How many? Oh, you're right. I was referring to the Resident Evil remake. My apologies. Different Resident Evil games have been made multiple times. They're pretty much in the same boat as Final Fantasy games. They kind of just blend together, and it becomes hard to separate them really based on remakes. So, Rainbow Six on the N64 had a large blueprint layout of the map that showed where everything was. And your goal was to then, with the analog stick, draw a path that you would go through. It would show where enemies were, it would show where objectives were, it would show where items were, where the extraction point is, yada, yada, yada. You would draw a path where your group would follow, your group would come with you, and you would draw the path through the level. And then you would get your group, you would equip them, suit them up, and then you would start the level. And again, your AI group would follow down that path, so you could deviate from the path. Obviously, you want to stay with your group. But because you know where enemies are, the game essentially did the auto aim thing like like GoldenEye did, but a lot more extreme, where it would show once you got within range of an enemy, the game registered. It would auto aim to them and show crosshairs over them. So it became a thing where you would literally turn a corner, and if the enemy was in view, it would instantly crosshairs be over them. You pull the trigger and kill them. It became more a thing of trying to do the mission efficiently, trying to do it quick, trying to do it without people getting killed, because you had the knowledge of where everything was at all times. It was more about pulling it off. So while it had first-person shooter mechanics, it was a smaller tool that they use as opposed to that being the main focus of the game. But they clearly had influence from GoldenEye with the auto-aim mechanic and expanded a little bit further there. So after we have Tom Clancy Rainbow Six, we had Medal of Honor. The first Medal of Honor, this came out in 1999. This came out on Halloween 1999. This game, this one's interesting. I want you to try to picture in your head as I try to describe this controller scheme for you. So this was on the original PlayStation. A lot of people don't know that the original PlayStation, when it launched, had just the D-pad. It didn't have the analog sticks. Eventually, they released a controller that could have the dual analog sticks, but because it wasn't standard shipped with every PlayStation, especially from the beginning, a lot of the developers didn't want to try to make games that worked with this control scheme because they didn't want to split the player base, make it so players had to purchase another controller, things like that. But for games that did do it, Medal of Honor was one of them. So Medal of Honor had the dual analog control stick. So try to picture this in your head. The left analog stick in that game, when you moved it forwards, up and down, your character would move forwards and backwards. With same left analog stick, when you moved it left and right, your character would stand in place and pivot or rotate left and right. Then, with the right analog stick, when you pushed up and down, your character would look up and down. With that right analog stick, when you pushed it left and right, your character would strafe left and right. So you basically had your movement controls would be split between both the sticks, as well as your camera controls would be split between the two sticks. This was just crazy to me to imagine with how we have the standard now for first-person shooters. But this was pretty well received. It still had some of the other basic functions that other shooters would have, like the R2 button, or the R button would have like the little crosshairs appear so you can more finely aim where you wanted to specifically. But this was basically some of the earlier stages of dual stick controls for first-person shooters. It seems so standard and it seems so obvious that we would have each stick. One would be for movement, one would be for camera controls, but it took some time to get there. Hello, puppy. So the first example of modern dual stick controls that I could find was Alien Resurrection, that released on PlayStation. This was another game that also was on the original PlayStation that had the dual analog stick controls. This was Alien Resurrection. A lot of people know Alien is the first one, Aliens is the second one, and Alien 3 was the third one. A lot of people don't realize there was a fourth one called Alien Resurrection. This was a game based off that movie. And this was the game that had its first, that, as far as I could tell, the first instance of left analog stick is for movement, right analog stick is for controls. The really funny thing was, this was really hated. I found this excerpt from a GameSpot review that they said, and I quote, "The game's control setup is its most terrifying element. The left analog stick moves you forwards, back, and strafes left and right, while the right analog stick turns you and can be used to look up and down. Too often, you'll turn to face a foe and find that your weapon is aimed at the floor or ceiling, while the alien gleefully hacks away at your midsection. I find it hilarious that what is the standard that anyone, like, if a game were to come out, a first-person shooter coming out on console that didn't have this control scheme, people would think they were absolutely crazy. And this first introduction, people hate it because the tank controls were pretty much the standard and understood. And kind of just goes to show that people definitely like what they like, and they're not open to change. But sometimes the devs do know best. It was just that people didn't really want to move on from tank controls. It's so funny to hear someone say that about a control scheme that literally everyone uses now. It's just so funny to me. Aliene? It might be. One fitting it was an Alien game with Metroid. Yeah, actually, good point. I mean, think about that. Resurrection is better than 3. Don't at me. Dang. Tank controls suck. I agree. I'm not a fan of tank controls. So the last game that we'll briefly talk about when it comes to the evolution of FPS is Halo Combat Evolved. I don't know if you guys have heard of this one. This was a game that released on the Xbox, and this was the game that standardized shooter control schemes. This was the one that also had left analog stick to move, right analog stick to aim your camera. The mind-blowing monumental success of Halo basically standardized these rules, because while devs were still kind of tweaking and testing things like tank controls, Halo's success was so monumental that anyone who wanted to play a first-person shooter probably wanted to play it because they played Halo on console, that is. And because Halo had their control schemes the way that they did, everyone else built it off of that because they wanted to try to draw from the Halo crowd. So because Halo did the dual stick control scheme, and it was monumentally successful, all following first-person shooters on console pretty much had to follow that same control scheme because they wanted to pull people from the Halo franchise. So basically, the release of Halo, the first Halo, standardized and is why we have the first-person control schemes by default that we have currently. So that probably should have changed the title to Brief History of FPSs. Okay, so now we talked a decent amount on a lot of different things. Does anyone want to bring up anything else about first-person shooters before we move on real quick? How I love you so. Leading in from that, we'll just take a quick, brief overview and just go over the major points that we've talked about up until this point. So, what Metroid is to Nintendo. Metroid is one of Nintendo's OG original IPs, only being predated by Mario, Zelda, and Donkey Kong. And Metroid was essentially a creation, a Frankenstein's monster, except it's not a monster, a amalgamation of Mario and Zelda, with Mario's platforming and Zelda's adventure aspects. The series is very different from anything that Nintendo had made prior, or most gaming in general, whereas the atmosphere is much more bleak, it's much more dark, it's much more isolated and alone, as opposed to being more of an escape, a sense of adventure. Metroid had 3 games. It had the original one that came out on NES in 1986, the one that came on Game Boy in 1991, and the one that came on SNES in 1994. I do want to briefly touch on this. Metroid 1 was about just establishing the rules of the franchise, the whole Metroidvania formula, essentially. Going through, adventuring, getting upgrades, backtracking to new areas, and accessing new areas based on those upgrades. 1994, or the 1991 release of Metroid 2 on the Game Boy was not like this. It was much more of a typical action-adventure where you progress forward, you kill Metroids, and every time that you kill a Metroid, you unlock new areas. The big thing that this game did, was it established more of the universe of the Metroid universe, whereas you had very little info on Samus, what her mission was or what she was doing, or her personality, or the world in general. Metroid 2, her goal was to go and exterminate, basically perform genocide on the Metroid race, so they couldn't be used for evil. It showed that Samus was human, that she had emotions. She wasn't just a killing monster, because one of the Metroids at the end imprints on her, basically sees it as her mom, and she can't go through with actually killing it. So it actually builds more personality. It builds something of Samus aside the fact that she's a female. It gives some sort of personality and also some of her motivations as to what she does in general. So while it was a very big deviation from the original Metroid formula, it still built up more of the world. And then Super Metroid, the third one on the SNES, was a more return to form of the first one. However, it was a much cleaner, much more polished version of the original one. And actually, so the most important game in this series, stories-wise. So I should also say I am the least familiar with Metroid 2. I do know, well, I still have not played the original Metroid. I have played the original Metroid, haven't completed it. I have not played Super Metroid at all. I've seen tons of videos over the past year because Super Metroid's constantly brought up. I know so much about Super Metroid at this point. I know a little bit about Metroid 2, not a whole lot. This was just all stuff that I've gathered based on minor research on it, because it was kind of a smaller side thing that came up fairly infrequently. But that is the three different things that those three games have done, have brought to the series: establishing it, building a little bit more of the world, and then polishing it. The reason why we did not have a Metroid game for so long was because Nintendo just couldn't think of any ideas, really. They didn't want to force out a game, and they could not think of anything allowing them to skip that awkward transition period. But now going into GameCube, have much more hardware, much better control schemes to build a game. The games leading up to Prime was still Nintendo's, stereotypical expected thing: happy-go-lucky, kid-friendly, kid-centric poppy games. With still clear demand for a dark type of game based on the release or the reception to Wind Waker. And there were lots of different games that were successful in the gaming space that that shows that there's still demand for the type of game that Metroid was. However, there were very few first-person shooters on console, and there was pretty much no first-person platformers, and I couldn't find an example of a shooter combined with a platformer. So while there was still demand for the individual aspects that Prime had on different consoles, it was very much uncharted territory leading into the release of Metroid Prime. It was very ambitious move to kill off your titular alien species. Literally the second game of your series. Yeah, I guess it is. Okay. Okay, this is where we get into actually discussing Metroid Prime itself and its release. This section is going to be long, so we got a lot to discuss here. So, with Metroid, as I said before, Metroid Prime, when it was coming, was as a result of Miyamoto visiting Retro Studios, when they had a 5-game contract with them. 4 of them really did nothing to impress him. One of them stood out, and Miyamoto likes it so much that he pitched the idea it should become a Metroid game. After getting the clearance and the okay, Miyamoto and the team sat down and they had a discussion. What was it about the Metroid games that they love? What about Metroid, exclusive to Metroid, about its game? What is it that made them love that series? And they went down, and I do know they had this discussion. We have not been given a list of what they decided on, but I think it's safe to assume that this discussion was basically a rubric or a skeleton that they used to design Metroid Prime. Looking at the design of Metroid Prime, I think I can pick out some of the things that they established and settled on, and I want to list them and give examples as to why. So, you're going to talk about the famous meeting Retro had with Miyamoto with a prototype of Prime? I did not see anything about that. I didn't see anything about a prototype of Prime. Just a prototype of a game that was codenamed Action Adventure. And Miyamoto said that it would work perfect for the Metroid series. Okay, that's very important. I have not heard about this. If there's like an interview or something like that, yeah. Hold on to that. I am curious about that, and we'll get into that at some point later. because I want to continue on with the list I have here and read that later. So I think one of the clear, obvious examples of things that happen specifically in the Metroid series, but also Metroid Prime, is paths blocking off new areas requiring power-ups. There's so many different examples. There's in the original Super Metroid, there's the long hallway that has the spikes, and also very important that these block-offs, these areas you can't get by, are not arbitrary or obscure. They're usually very distinct, either color-coded, new mechanics or aesthetics, new threats, something that stands out. In Super Metroid, there's a hallway that you come across that's a very long hallway that has spikes all across the bottom. You cannot jump it, you cannot make it across these, and the spikes do a ton of damage. A lot of people go in there, try to get across, die, be mad, and then go back and look at it again. And they will usually tend to remember this long hallway that's got spikes on the floor and this new texture on the ceiling that stands out from everything else. And they will realize later, once they get the grapple beam and they're tutorializing how to use it, with this new texture on the ceiling, like, oh, that's right, I remember this room, and they can go back and now get across the room with the spikes. There's another room in Super Metroid where there is a ledge that's just out of reach. You try to jump to it, but you just can't make it. And it's not just that. On the ledge, you can see the ledge, and there's a giant maw. There's like an open beast, basically, its mouth open. Looks very overwhelming, very, very scary. And the fact that you can't reach it, but you want to know what's there, this giant monster definitely stands out in your memory. It's not the fact that you couldn't get to a ledge, but this creature that's standing on the top that's just out of reach, that is what sticks out in your mind. And once you eventually get the double jump, you realize, oh, I can go back to this area. I can now jump up there and reach that. Things like that were prevalent in Metroid. It's different areas that you cannot get by. They're blocked off by power-ups, but they usually stand out in your head in some way. So examples like this are obviously the doorways in throughout Metroid Prime. There's the blue doors, which are just standard. You have the white doors where you need the ice beam. You have the purple doors where you need the wave beam. You have the red doors where you need the plasma beam, things like that. There's other things as well, like the spider ball track. The magnetic rails that take you all throughout a bunch of different rooms that usually are in obstacles that you can't get across, like the lava pit and Magmore Caverns. And there's other rooms that just, they completely scale the walls of the entire room, stuff that very much stands out to you later. There's also examples, which this one's interesting. I wonder how much this stood out, because there's half-pipe locations all throughout Metroid Prime. They're basically, skateboard half-pipes that perfectly rounded that go up and down, and you get an upgrade where you have the spider ball and you get a dash, and it shows you can dash up and down the sides of them right immediately after you get it. It tutorializes you on this. And I wonder how many people notice this on their casual playthrough, because again, this was also the first time in 3D. You're looking for things completely different than you looked for in 2D. So I wonder how much of an impact this had and how much this stuck out in people's heads. But I feel like once people realize that, once they pass through it again, immediately stuck out in their head. So they took the whole aspect of requiring power-ups to get through to new areas, made them stand out and much more obvious, and brought that into Metroid Prime. That was one of the big staples of the original Metroid games. Another thing that I think they pulled over was the large interwoven map, where it folds back in on itself. This Metroid was a game where, as you're progressing through the map, you would eventually double back into previous areas you had already been to. This was something that happened in Metroid Prime as well. This would lead to different shortcuts that would go to previous areas that you had been to before. Maybe these were new areas you could reach in the first place, but it had a more natural and organic feel. It didn't feel like a video game. It didn't feel like a dungeon that was created specifically for the player. It felt like a real world that existed, that you as a character while playing the video game just happened to stop in on. And because you pass through so many half-pipes before Boost Ball, the player begins to think, why there's so many perfectly circular areas in otherwise rough terrain. I remember when I casually played through it for the first time, that first half-pipe that you find in the Chozo Ruins definitely stood out in my head. That immediately stood out. The one for the Talon overworld blended in a lot more. Did not see that at first. Another thing that was very common in the original Metroid was obviously the exploration aspect. This is the Zelda aspect, where you go around and you are, you find a door, it's locked, and you got to figure out how to get the upgrade. It pushes players to explore more. You go to a new area, you hit a dead end, you realize you can't progress this way. And it doesn't necessarily tell you how to get through it. It doesn't tell you where the upgrade is. It tells you, you can't get through this door, you need a different beam, but it doesn't tell you exactly where it is. It emphasizes you can't progress past this point, you need to go somewhere else. It was guiding the player, but not forcing them down a certain hallway. And this was, again, the exact same thing in Super Metroid as it was in Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime, as we've talked multiple times, was all about the isolation type of environment, and they went the exact same way when it came to Metroid Prime. They had no NPCs, no one to speak to. The only type of interaction that you have with any kind of good character would be the Chozos, as they leave messages behind in their ruins. But other than that, there is no NPCs. There is no characters that you speak to. You are completely isolated on your own. Every character that you come across is a hostile character. Metroid Prime is in many senses a 3D imagining of Metroid Prime. That's basically what it is. It's them bringing it into 3D, and this is listing the things that they found from Metroid. Specifically, they isolated the things that they liked about Metroid and then figured out how to transition it into 3D, which is what a lot of game devs should do, finding out what it was about previous games that they enjoyed and then find out how to expand on them. We'll definitely talk about different changes that they had to make to Metroid coming into 3D and the different things that they had to do to expand on it, but this is just listening to the things that they clearly transitioned from one to the other. So on the topic of isolation, seclusion, and danger all around, I do want to talk about something briefly. Color theory in video games is very interesting. Players tend to associate certain colors with certain things. They tend to associate black with death. They tend to associate red with blood or danger or fighting, green with mana, things like that. Purple as a color in video game tends to be associated with corruption and poison. The reason for this is probably tied to royalty, if anything, because purple as a color was originally a color that was only associated with royalty, because when the color was discovered, because it so rarely occurs in nature naturally, it had to be taken from certain snails in very minuscule amounts to get anything sizable out of it. They had to get a ton to make any clothes of it. So in order to do it, you had to be rich, and purple was a color associated with royalty. And I think from that point, it was very easy to associate the color purple with corruption and toxicity. And that transitioned into video games as time went on. And you can see this in video games in tons of different examples. Just name a few. There's the toxic sludge in Breath of the Wild. The ones that have the little eyeballs, and when you shoot the eyeballs, it disappears into a cloud of smoke. This sludge is a purple-black color. Poison types in Pokemon, their colors associated with purple entirely. Poison gas, when you see in video game, yep, there you go, Tori. Purple that you see is usually associated with just poison gas as a generic color, whether it be cartoons or video games. Anything that's a toxic gas usually is colored in purple. Gosh, I'm forgetting her name. In Celeste, is Madeline the main character's name? I think that's her name. Her dark version, her alternate version, her corrupted version, her depression that's trying to corrupt her, that alternate version of her has purple hair and a purple aura around her. The entire corruption biome in Terraria is themed around the color purple. Purple is known as a color that's associated with corruption and toxic and poison and infection. And when you look at Metroid Prime, when you get to the Phazon and Phazon starts having appearance, it's a purple color. Phazon is literally an infection. It is something that comes to the planet on a meteor, and once it crash lands on the planet, it's literally infecting the planet. It's infecting the Metroids to become more aggressive. It's killing the planet. It's becoming it's the Chozo, the one species that's considered good that leaves these messages behind. The one time that you actually see and interact with them at all is the spirits left behind by the Chozo that gets infected by the Phazon and attacks Samus in an aggressive rage because they've lost control of themselves. It's literally infected them to attack Samus. So the Phazon, denoted by the color purple, is in later segments of the game, but it has this it's the color purple, which has this feeling of danger around it. You have an entire section that's just covered in this purple sludge, this Phazon. And it also has, I believe, arcing electricity on it. Poison gas from Pikmin 2. There's another one. I believe it has arcing electricity on it. Well, it has a crackling noise. Just everything about it just screams of danger from a design standpoint, and really leads into the whole isolation. Everything is trying to kill you here feeling that previous Metroid games have had, but with this new extra mechanic that the game is focused around, that's its entire design, is stay away from this. This will infect you. This will kill you. You need to leave, type of thing. Chozo goes. It scared most people as a kid too. The screams that they made, the fact they disappeared, it's so much health. Chozo ghosts were definitely terrifying when you first encounter them. Also important to note, the Chozo are set up as these ethereal, enlightened, almost godlike beings, and they're absolutely devastated by Phazon. That's actually a good point. The Chozo are creatures that have basically reached nirvana in the game. They have, they even say that they leave behind their physical form to become more at peace or more in connection with the planet and nature itself. They effectively become spirits in the perfect form, living beings in the perfect form, so in connected with nature and the natural state of being that Phazon is able to take that form and still corrupt it and make them these aggressive monsters. It's, yeah, very, very strong force. Very, very powerful, overwhelming force. Poison stuff. Fang from Street Fighter V is the dude who fights with purple poison and wears a purple suit and hat. I did not know that. What's his name? The boss in Dark Souls. One of the 4 big ones. The giant skeleton dude who's at the bottom of the catacombs. God, I forget his name. He is a giant skeleton who's coated in a purple... Nito, thank you. He is covered in like this purple cloudy evil veil as well. It's one of those things where if you look for it, the color purple is everywhere in video games, and 99% of the time it is associated with some kind of corruption, specifically infection, something that doesn't belong and needs to be expunged. It needs to be removed because whatever it is, it's causing harm, it's causing problems. It's an infection or corruption every single time. Look out for it. You will see it everywhere. Another thing that they definitely obviously pulled from the previous Metroid games was the platforming. It is all throughout Metroid, the original Metroid, Super Metroid, and it's common in Metroid Prime. And I'm sure this is probably a difficult thing for them to discuss or really try to get working because it was in a first-person space, but they did not want to leave it behind and they made it work. Something that was very important in previous Metroid games was tangible and clear examples of your progress through the game making previous areas more easy. Whether it be so that your upgrades that you receive make it so going past through a room is a lot easier. Like, for example, in the Magmore Caverns, there is rooms where to get through, you had to platform by jumping on these platforms along the outside of the room to get to the next area. But once you get the grapple beam, there's a little hook at the top where you can skip all that platforming section along the outside and just swing across lava and get to the next area. There are things like that where you get an upgrade and all of a sudden a room that you had to do some kind of puzzle, some platforming, some monster fighting, anything like that, you can skip all of that because you have clearly advanced as a character. You've gotten better that you don't have to deal with it anymore. There are certain enemies that were troublesome, that were difficult. They were either bullet sponges, they had a lot of health, they would avoid your attacks or whatever. Once you come back later and you have more upgrades, you can kill them a lot easier. There's a little enemy that when you are far away from it, it just kind of goes along its way. But once you get close to it, spikes pop out of its body and your bullets no longer do a thing. But once you get missiles, regardless of if its spikes are popped out, it's just an insta-kill on it. There is, back in the Magmore Caverns, there's, I don't know what they're called, like just basically like a lava worm that kind of jumps out of the lava and spits fire at you. Quite a bit of health. They're a bit of a bullet sponge. And if you have the ice beam, you hit them with 5 shots and they're instantly dead. Or you hit them with 1 shot, they freeze in place for about 5-10 seconds. You can just go on your merry way and they're no longer a threat at all, as opposed to being this terrifying monster that comes out from nowhere and it's usually right near where you need to be and basically give you 3rd-degree burns. No longer an issue anymore. What was originally a huge threat or a nuisance is now something you no longer need to think twice about. These upgrades would also not just make backtracking easier, but give reason to backtrack. So every time you would get an upgrade, you would have to go now to a previous area in the game. You would have to go and take that upgrade to unlock something else in a previous area you could no longer reach. Normally, most people don't like backtracking. They don't like having to go through areas that they've already completed. Metroid Prime, with their with Metroid in general, but they also carried over into Metroid Prime, was getting upgrades along the way. It's not just going back to this previous area. It's also about getting upgrades along the way, because in a previous room on the way to where you need to go, there is a new area you can access with an upgrade. So it motivates, it makes it so backtracking is no longer a tedious thing, but also a fun thing, between making it so rooms that were a hassle or took forever to get through are now so much quicker. You also can get other upgrades and bonuses and improvements along the way as well. Has no boss. I thought there was supposed to be a boss there. There's a beta image showing him Firebase. Really? Do you have a picture of that? I did not know that. No, I never even thought about the fact that Magmore Caverns has no boss. I just kind of figured it was because of it was the main interconnecting area. Interesting. The old god sections of Cataclysm of the world were all purple as well. You'll find it everywhere, man. Once you realize the color purple's corruption, you'll start seeing it all over the place. Another thing that Super Metroid and Prime do super well is slowly introducing more and more obstacles for power-ups that you're getting close to obtaining. Yep. And then once you obtain it, give you immediate examples of how to use it, often trapping you until you solve a puzzle in your tool. That's just common good game design in general. For example, when you we talked about the Spider Ball before, Spider Ball Boost specifically, where you go through the half pipes. It shows you what's basically, you go into the Spider Ball and you charge up and you dash forward. Just seems like a basic dash that lets you go quicker, but you would never think that you can use it in a half pipe. That's why in order to leave the room, you must overcome this. It's showing you one big use of the Spider Ball, doing the half pipe, because you cannot leave the room until you go up and down the half pipe. That's just good game design in general, not exclusive to Metroid Prime. Once you get a new upgrade, how you can use it or what you should use it for. It's like when you get the regular Spider Ball, not the boost, but just the regular Spider Ball, you jump into a pit where you fight an enemy, and then once you get the Spider Ball, you can't jump out of the pit. You can't jump out of there, get out of there anyway at all, unless you get the Spider Ball. Once you do, there's a little narrow hole that you can slide on through and continue on your merry way. But yes, in terms to those obstacles appearing shortly before getting the upgrade, but right before you get the ice beam, there's doors in like the 3 rooms prior leading up to it that can only be opened by the ice beam, things like that. It makes it so you have immediate use to test it out and try it out and get access to new areas and feel excited that you have this new upgrade and that it is useful to get into new rooms. Man, talking for an hour and a half straight. Definitely feeling it. Also, one more thing I want to touch on about the backtracking and how it feels better. The great thing about this ties into the interconnecting world, the fact that the world wraps back around on itself. As you get more upgrades, it allows more paths to open up. There's, certain paths that you did not know existed. There's certain paths that you knew existed, but you're not a fan of going through them. So a lot of people would like to go just the quickest way from point A to point B. It no longer is about that. It can become this path A is quicker, but path B is more fun, or it's not nearly as frustrating. So they might actually take path B because it's not nearly as grating. Path A might be quicker, but path C has 2 upgrades along the way. It now is not just a matter of going from point 1 to point 2 as quickly as possible. You now have, as you get these upgrades, multiple varying different paths you can go to, and it's up to you to decide which one that you want to go on. Do you want to go down the quickest one? Do you want to go down the one that's the most fun? Do you want to go down the one that allows you to use your new power up the most? Do you want to go down the one that allows you to get different upgrades, the most upgrades along the way? It's these tangible upgrades are not just about making it so rooms are easier. It's also about making it so they're funner. It's making it so it's quicker. It's making it so that you have access to multiple different upgrades or new places you couldn't reach before. The fact that this I think was the best example that they did about bringing over into Super Metroid into Metroid Prime. It's just so beautifully done. Oh, is this the Metroid Prime cuts and changes? Interesting. Oh, wow. Interesting. I am going to be looking at this later. That seems fascinating. Yes, please. Cool. Thank you. We'll be, once I like go through, because I have an entire document that's 11 pages of stuff that we're discussing here. Once we're done with it, we will absolutely be going through and looking at any links that you guys have important for discussion or add to the discussion, questions, things like this that Jay posted. We'll be talking about this stuff. So yes, hang on to those for sure. So those are the established rules that were in the original Metroid series that they carried on over into this game. But going from 2D into 3D is a very difficult thing. Not every game can do it, and games that can do it, it's not always done well. Either because it's just done poorly or it can't be done well. Hello.
How's your book club going?
It's going pretty good.
It's going really good?
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi.
I know you.
Anyway, you too.
Have fun with your book club.
I'm having fun.
Okay.
Okay.
Chum tried to beat me at the Fall Guys, but I stole the tail from him last second and I won.
Oh, you stole the victory from him?
1 second left.
Oh my gosh. So
It's really
mean.
hard. I'm sorry to interrupt it.
It's okay.
But hope you have a nice, good discussion.
Thank you. It's been going pretty good so far. Bye. So not every game can transition from 2D to 3D, and even the ones that can do it don't necessarily do it well. Sometimes you need to make changes, and Metroid definitely had to make some changes to move into 3D, and Retro was not scared to do it, and thank God they weren't, because they did some really good changes. So one of the big things about going from 2D into 3D is platforming, especially in this case where they went to 3D first-person platforming. So Metroid had the most of the platform. I mean, you would have these segments where you go down these long tubes, where you would have to jump on these smaller platforms while avoiding enemies and trying not to land in spikes and things like that. But they also had these long towers where you had to jump up to platforms up above you and continue climbing while avoiding enemies and things like that. If you got hit by something while climbing up in these towers, you could just get that perfect angle where you fall quite a bit ways down just because you happen to not land any platforms. You could be knocked back and try to recorrect yourself and land on a platform, but overshoot it or miss it and then continue going down. This can be frustrating in general, but this was also in 2D. In 3D with first person, platforming is incredibly difficult because it's very difficult to make it so that you can look and see where it is that you're going and trying to land while also looking down at your feet to know where it is that you're landing. It's near impossible to see where it is that you want to land and where it is that you are landing. Yeah, I played the original Metroid Electric, and that was by far my most hated part about that game. I absolutely hated those long towers where you climb up. I hated those because if you fell, so much lost progress. But yes, I know, puppy. You need attention. What was I saying? One of these. Ah, yes. So because of this, it was so much more difficult to do in first person because you can't see where you're trying to jump and where you are jumping. So it's a lot easier to miss a platform in first person as a result. To make this work, they still had a couple vertical rooms like that in Metroid. However, they made the platforms much larger and the rooms were smaller. So if you did mess up and even if you did fall to the bottom, it wasn't nearly as costly or big of a mistake. They made the platforms much bigger in Metroid, and something that I think they kind of just had to throw at the wall and see if it stuck, and thankfully it did. Very interesting. If you play the game and you look at it, you'll notice that when you jump, effectively your feet are about chest height. If you're jumping to a platform, and from where the camera view is because it's first person, when you're making the jump, effectively, if you're landing on the platform just enough, it's about chest height, lower chest height. Very difficult. You would expect it to have to be so much further below your feet, but they're much more generous about what it is that you are and are not allowed to make up onto it. But because of the fact they moved into first person, they couldn't have precise platforming as a challenge. It became more of a puzzle trying to figure out where it is that you need to jump or where it is that you need to progress. Instead of it becoming the challenge of platforming itself, it's figuring out where you need to go. It was one of the changes that they had to make. Very, very interesting one that I don't really see brought up a lot. They had to change the speed of the game quite a bit moving into 3D. So in Super Metroid and in 2D games in general, you have the screen, you can see where Samus is, you could see where enemies are, you could see where the ceiling is, you can see where platforms are, you can see where spikes on the ground maybe, you can see where projectiles coming from the enemies maybe. You have so much information and you could see all of this relative to the position of Samus. When you're in first person, you don't have this luxury. You have what is viewable in front of you. You have a cone. It's interesting because it gives you more information but gives you less information. What it is that's in front of you is so much more clear. It's got so much more fidelity. You can see so many more minor details that allow for completely different experiences overall. It fundamentally changes things because while you have a little radar in the corner that shows you there's an enemy behind you, you don't know whether they are moving towards you. You don't know if they are attacking you. You don't know if they're shooting a projectile at you. If there's a projectile at you, where it is. You don't know if you need to jump. You don't know if you need to move. If you do need to jump or you need to move, you don't know which direction or when that you need to do it. All this information is completely lost to the player because of a difference in perspective. Because in 2D, you have all this information, they can make things go a little bit faster because the player has all this information coming to them and they can react in time. In first person, they don't quite have this, especially in the earlier ages of this when they have less control. They had to slow down the game quite a bit. There are certain things, Samus's bullets when she shoots her gun are incredibly quick because it's obviously the player would like something that's more responsive. They want to press a button and have an instant reaction to it. But most of the game is a lot slower. There's the occasional faster enemies. There's characters that dash at you, but usually characters that have something about them that's fast. That's pretty much all that's about them. That's really their only threat. The change in speed was very, very important and might have been a little bit shocking to people, and a lot of people might not have liked it, but it was definitely the best call. But the really interesting about this is why the morph ball was able to work, and it was able to work as well as it did. So when you go into the morph ball, the camera pans out to a third person view. Once you're in the third person view, it kind of has a similar effect to, the 2D aspects of Metroid, where you have so much more information. You can see around Samus entirely. You can see Samus and everything relative to around her position. And you're also not required to turn around or anything like that. You can move in any direction immediately. This allows for control of the player to be so much more fine-tuned. You can actually increase the speed and allow them to react better. It's a nice little, it feels organic, it feels natural, but it also is a nice little fun reward to go into the morph ball phase, because when you're in the morph ball phase, you still do have the means to defend yourself with the mini bomb and the power bomb as well, but Samus doesn't have nearly as much range. She can't jump obviously nearly as high. To come out of the morph ball takes some time. So the trade-off is you have the camera so you can see more around you, but you actually get the increased speed. A lot of people, I haven't heard anyone really talk about that, and I thought that was really important and a very good decision to slow down the game while in the first-person view, but then increase the speed when you're going to the morph ball, which is the third-person view. There are a lot of games that have wiggle room as a hidden mechanic. What do you mean by wiggle room, specifically? They'll talk the long enemy filled elevators sucked. There's a reason Super Metroid reworked basically all of them. Really? How did they rework them in Super Metroid? Like I said, have not played Super Metroid. I've seen quite a few videos, but obviously those videos are not going to cover every topic or aspect of the game. Professor Screaming on Stead talk about Metroidology. I did my research. I love game design. It's so cool. This is stuff I never would have noticed or even thought about before. So for other things that they've had to change, we have the combat in the game. Obviously, going from third person into first person is very difficult. This is the part where we talk about the shooter aspects of the game. Going from 2D into 3D is just exponentially different in what you need to take note of and take account of, where enemies could hurt you or attack you or aim at you from, is exponentially more in third person. So it can be kind of difficult to move from second person to third person. The decision that they made to change combat in the game was to make it less of a main focus of the combat and more of a temporary puzzle, is how I like to view it. They made it so it's not about, like in earlier Metroid games, you would look at the character, see how it is that they behaved and how they would interact with Samus, and then react accordingly, lead your shots, bait them, move in certain ways, things like that. There is a certain aspect to that with this game, but because of the addition of the L button in Metroid Prime, when you press the L button while a character is generally in your view, Samus will immediately snap to her, and the reticle will be aimed directly on the enemy. And then you press the shoot button, and the bullet comes out and it hits them. Most cases, some of them are fast. But you immediately aim on, lock on, press shoot, and you're shooting at them. This makes it so you're no longer having to lead your shots as much. You're no longer having to try to guide them or bait them into certain things as much. It becomes a case of enemies have their own weaknesses. They have the beetle where you can't hit it from the front. It's about waiting. It's about being aware of their existence and trying to jump around them and shoot them from the back. It's about understanding that certain enemies can't be seen unless they have specific visors. Certain enemies can't be damaged unless they're hit with certain beams. Certain enemies can barely be damaged unless they're using certain beams. Things like that. It becomes a case of no longer being precise with your aiming of your shots. It's now a mini puzzle of figuring out how to beat the specific enemy and taking care of them at the time. Also, the benefits to this is now for people who aren't as precise or not as good as aiming, maybe kids or older people, they are no longer completely barred from the game because of the combat aspect of the game. Because again, it simplifies it in a certain way, or rather repurposes it into a more puzzle aspect as opposed to a direct combat aspect. Also, another thing to bring up is while locking onto the character, you can still move around, so it becomes it makes it so you must be aware of your surroundings. You could accidentally walk off and then fall into lava and start taking damage, or fall into phase on and start taking damage, or fall into the water, and now you're sinking into the water and your movement is slowed down, or there could be an enemy behind you. It's about not just focusing on the enemy that you're shooting at, but being more aware of your surroundings around you. Basically adding more places to land. Oh, did they remove enemies entirely in Super Metroid for the tall platforming sections, or just reduce them? Do a ton of dissection on FromSoft's design on Soulsborne and Sekiro, not just game hard, gameplay rough. Yeah, that's just the when Dark Souls. I don't know about the Demon Souls, but I do know Dark Souls. When it came out, it was at a time when gaming was meant to be more accessible and they were made easier in general. So when Dark Souls came out, it was unabashedly, it wasn't hard, it just wasn't forgiving, and that is what a lot of people latched onto. And there's a lot of good design that goes into Dark Souls, and I plan on talking about it. I'm gonna play the Demon Souls games and then Dark Souls as well, to see how Demon Souls evolves into Dark Souls. And if I've watched a ton of videos of these game design videos, and they constantly reference Dark Souls, and it almost seems like a meme, but there's a reason it's constantly referenced. Dark Souls has a lot of really fantastic game design decisions in that game. Really, really well done. It's more zoomed in than Metroid 1. Really? Interesting. I didn't know that. Mad at my Arnie. Alright. Oh, also, one more thing to bring about combat. Enemies. There are a couple enemies that do fire rapidly, and their bullets do travel very quickly, but combat in that game also is more focused around not killing them before they kill you in sheer damage output. It's about avoiding their shots and picking away at their health. It's about knowing how it is that they attack and dodging it and avoiding it as you basically sink shots into them as well, which I think was pretty different at first-person shooters at the time. Something that they decided to do different with Metroid Prime 2 was the way that they presented story. This was the first 3D game, first 3D Metroid game. Samus had appeared in Smash Melee, so she had appeared in some kind of 3D space beforehand. But this was the first time that Metroid had its own 3D game. So Miyamoto wanted to add more story, but he specifically wanted to do more cinematic story. So they decided to bookend cinematic cutscenes, where the game starts off with a cutscene and it ends with the cutscene. And in terms of the middle of the story, it was optional. They did a little different, because when doing Metroid Prime, basically the main motivation you have to go to the planet is to chase down Ridley. That's pretty much your story. Getting extra story and lore and information was something that the devs wanted to have, not forced. They also wanted to make, because they were adding a lot more lore and story to the game, they wanted to add it in chunks that were more digestible and also more consumable at the player's pace that they preferred, which is why they did this cutscene at the beginning, they did the cutscene at the end, and then in the middle they had these chunks where you can go and scan a bunch of stuff to get lore, but it was completely up to you. It was optional to the player. You're not required to sit there and scan every single computer. You're not sit there and required to listen to a full-fledged conversation. It's up to the player how they want to do it, how quick they want to do it, and it's done in these chunks. There's not every single room that you go into, there's another log that gives a little story. There's like, okay, here's gameplay for a while. Once you get into this pirate lab, you now have access. You can take this 10 minutes if you want to, read all the lore that you want to, and then continue on with the story. It was definitely a unique way that they did it in gaming in general, where the story was a lot optional. And also on the it was basically up to the player how they wanted to do it. But this was them trying to create and expand the world a little bit more, give some backstory more to the pirates and who they were and what their motivations were. Very, very similar to Super Metroid in that regard as well. Super Metroid is bookended by cutscenes. Yes, basically just forced gameplay where the controller is taken away from the player for a moment. Yes, it was much more simplistic. They still had cutscenes, but they weren't cinematic cutscenes like the degree they went to in Metroid Prime. Man, so many Nintendo games that technically wasn't made by Miyamoto, but he did pop into the office. Was like, hey, do this, and that's cool. Bye. I was talking about this earlier, Tori, but basically, to summarize it, Retro had a contract with Nintendo to make 5 different games. The progress was having some issues moving along, so Miyamoto popped in to see how things were going, found 4 of the 5 games, just had zero interest in them, but one of them stood out, codename Action Adventure, and Miyamoto was like, this is good. I think this could be a Metroid game. And they're like, really? He's like, yeah. So he got approved from Nintendo executives, and they decided to make a Metroid game, and they worked very close in hand with each other. So he just happened to pop in, go, these 4 are trash, but this one's good. Let's make it a Metroid game. And then they were very close in connection with each other through the development process. Okay. So, yeah, the way that they did the story presentation was very different because they had access to more that they couldn't do on the console. All right. So, this is one of my favorite things about this game so much. So, you look at the UI for Super Metroid. It's got the very typical standard stuff you expect in a video game. It's got, you know, at the top, it's got health. It's got your missile count. It's got a mini-map of the room, stuff like that. Metroid Prime does something different that I absolutely love and would love if more games did it, but it's very, very, very difficult to pull off. Metroid Prime has something called diegetic UI. Now, a diegetic element in a video game is something that exists in the game world and it exists in the 3D space. What that basically means is it's something that's viewable to both the player and the characters in game. So, for example, if you have in certain games, I think it's The Witcher has it, where there'll be a light path that kind of strews across the ground that leads you to where you need to go. That's something the player can see, but characters in game cannot see that. That's something for the player only to see. That's not diegetic UI. Diegetic is something that both the characters playing the game can see, and also that's something both the characters in game can see and the player can see. This is incredibly difficult to do for a UI specifically, because we as gamers, well, the point of a diegetic UI is, or why most people tend to do it, is they try to make the game more immersive. The problem is we as gamers are so used to what the standard is. Like I talked earlier about the color theory kind of thing. You know, purple's the type of, is a color corruption, and green is usually like the color of mana or some, you know, allies and things like that. If they randomly made it so that in another game in this world that they build, purple is the item that you get that, you know, heals everyone, it's a medicine, and then you have green, which is the toxic substance that kills the people, that might be better for the world, and therefore your counter might be, you know, a poison meter or a damage meter could be built up in green, and then your health could be purple. Could work for the world itself, but it's not something that we as gamers are built to expect in games. In games, we expect in the bottom right corner, that is where your ammo meter is supposed to be. If it's not there, if instead, while your character's holding up their gun and you see on their arm, let's say it's a shotgun, and you see 6 bullet shells, and because it's a futuristic game, every time they shoot the shot, the bullet feeds into their suit and then immediately loads into the gun so they don't have to reload, it's quicker. That might be realistic and how the world itself is built, but if there's no ammo counter in the bottom, you know, the bottom corner of the screen, and you're having to look at your arm because you can't remember that's where your ammo counter is and you got to count it, you're consciously aware that things are different. That's not natural. It's frustrating, and while it is diegetic, it's not doing its job. It's not being immersive. If you take certain video gamey aspects like a health meter out of the game, it may make it seem less video gamey, but because we're aware of it, it takes us out of the video game experience as a result. So making a diegetic UI, something that's unique to the game world itself, that fits into the game universe and is natural and is informative and gives all the information that we need, to pull that off is incredibly difficult. The only examples that I can really think of that do this well are Metroid Prime and Dead Space. Because there you go, somewhat. Dead Space does it. They have on the back of the character's suit in Dead Space, down his spinal column, he has lights. Starting from his neck right here and going all the way down, he has lights. And every time he gets hit, some of the lights go out and they start dimming down. Whenever he shoots, he can't just blind fire, he has to aim. So whenever he pulls up, it has like a little holographic thing pop out, and it shows the number of ammo shots next to it. That's where your ammo count is. It's stuff like that. It's built into the game. It's built into the game world. It's something that the player and the character can see, but it also gives information in a critical way, in a natural way, that's not frustrating or having us to look at it. Metroid Prime's UI interface is beautiful because you're seeing everything from the first-person view of Samus. So you're seeing it out of her visor, and her visor is going to give her all the important information. It's going to show the energy level, her health level, the energy of her suit. It's going to show how many missiles she has available. It's going to show a mini-map that shows the area she's in. It's going to show a radar for her immediate surrounding area. If you're fighting a boss, it would scan them and show them the health of the character. The UI in that game is so fucking good. I cannot gush more about it. And I really hope more devs will try this in the future, because good diegetic UI is phenomenal. It's so hard to pull up, but it's so good and it's so unique. It's nice when devs try something different, and I couldn't find anything that really did diegetic UI before Metroid Prime. Again, it's not something that's commonly done because it requires a lot more testing. It requires a lot more work to get done. And again, things are just kind of built to a standard that we as gamers expect, that to try something different can be frustrating. So they just go, we're not going to worry about that. We're not going to deal with it, because people know what to look for and where to look for it. It doesn't take them out of the experience. It doesn't feel video gamey. So it's just more safe to do a typical UI that most people expect. I really hope devs will try to do more diegetic UI, because it just feels so much more natural and it adds so much to the experience. I love the UI of Metroid Prime so much. Sorry, I had to gush over that so much. Okay, so does anyone have anything else that they want to bring up about what Metroid Prime itself does that it did different moving into a 3D space? I know I covered, I feel like I covered most stuff, but I don't know if anyone else has anything important that they want to bring up. And the lights go further down his back as he gets armor upgrades. That gets him more health. I did not know that. That's cool. Ammo counts. That's right. Halo's another example. When you're shooting, when you have the gun, you can see the ammo count on the little screen on the front of it. That's true. Yes, it's time to talk about Bughead Samus. I remember when we were developing Metroid Prime very early on, we were discussing with Mr. Miyamoto how we could explore Samus's control scheme or do something unique. Miyamoto said, well, what if Samus could take off her head and maybe put a head on that had bug eyes? Or a head that's still in the dark or whatever. Just switch heads. And we came out of a meeting and we went back to our office and we're like, bug eyes. And we drew a picture on the wall of Samus's helmet and then Samus with a bug head. And we just stared at it trying to understand. Surely he can't mean that he wants Samus to switch her heads and put on a bug head. And then we realized what he was saying. What if Samus had means of perceiving the world in a different way? Whereas with a Western developer, you might say, what if you had X-ray vision or what if you had thermal vision? He was saying how you perceive the world as a whole. And looking in that way, we start examining, will you perceive things with sound? Will you perceive things with light? That was what really kind of the origin of the whole visor system also occurred. Wow, interesting. I didn't even think about it. I mean, they did have the X-ray visor in Super Metroid, so there was something like that, but the whole visor system grew across the games. I remember, I mean, obviously in the standard one, there's the standard view, there's the scan visor, there's the X-ray visor, and there's the thermal visor. Metroid 2, I know, had the sound visor, but I can't remember the other visors they had. Wow, it did the bug head. That's so funny. Yeah, they said they were apparently when they were going through the development process of Metroid, they were communicating so much and going back and forth that every time they made an email, a new email, they numbered the email. So if they ever had to reference something in a previous email, they could say email number so-and-so. There was a lot of communication, and apparently they got better as time went on. But man, it was probably rough at first. Yeah, just a very little translation. After me be like, what the fuck is he talking about? Yep. I imagine it could be pretty difficult. Okay. I'm going to take like a short 5-minute break. I really got to pee. I'll be right back, and we're going to continue. We finished discussing the changes that Metroid Prime had going into 3D and its introduction to 3D in the first place. If anyone has any discussions, any other topics they want to talk about relating to Metroid Prime in 3D space itself, its transition to 3D, what it did different, what it left behind, things like that, you can bring that up in chat when I come back and we'll discuss it. But if no one has anything else, we're going to start discussing the reception of the game and what the opinion of the game was after it finally came out. So I'll be back in just a few minutes. I really got to pee. God, Arnold Palmer goes through me. All right. Miyamoto's definitely an eccentric guy. I imagine he's very interesting to work with. Mm-hmm. Pro and con of working with a man with childish wonder and imagination. I don't know what's the. I don't think that's a con necessarily. I would imagine probably the quote unquote worst thing about working with Miyamoto would be the fact that the man has had quite a bit of experience, and obviously you relent to experience, but I imagine it might be a little bit harder for him. Looks fucking. I did notice that too. I remember seeing that. I was like, interesting. Definitely could have been better. But it's really interesting too because you look at the cutscene for Melee they had at the beginning. The whole point of that cutscene, that beginning part, was to showcase the strength of the GameCube and what it can pull off. So, and granted, those weren't human faces, so they didn't have to worry about it being as realistic, but it was pre-rendered though, and what stopped them from pre-rendering the cutscenes from Super Metroid? I don't know. Saying that they had the strength and they had the capabilities. I don't know, but they didn't. So yeah, it's not necessarily the GameCube wasn't ready. They just chose not to. But what's really funny is that was we discussed this earlier, that it was the first Metroid 3D game that was on console, so they were really excited to really showcase Samus herself and her story more. Yet they decided not to do that cutscene. I don't know. I noticed that too when I saw it. I was like, ooh, older games, man, older consoles. But okay, does anyone have any more that they want to bring up about the actual release of it, the changes that they made to the game when it finally came out? So if not, we can start moving on to the actual reception that the game had upon its release. Also, hi, Bess. Reception. This music's so good. Metroid Prime series has officially moved on to being one of my top soundtracks in video gaming, period. It's just so fucking good. Oh, it's so good. Okay, so we'll actually move on to the reception of Metroid Prime. So the Metroid games up until that point, I keep forgetting to look up stuff about Metroid 2, the one on the GameCube, but the first two, Metroid and Super Metroid, were very, very well received. People absolutely love them. So following up on Metroid Prime was definitely a tough act to follow, but it went pretty good. Universal praise, I think, is in order to call it. So when it comes down to discussing this part, I thought the most effective way to really talk about this would be just by looking at Metacritic aggregate scores and things like that. Something that I think is kind of important to bring up, the way that Metacritic works is it basically takes official reviews in one category and player reviews into another category, and it separates them. When it comes to official reviews, for someone, it aggregates the score out of 100 and averages them. If someone does not give a direct number score, they just say it was good or it was great, or they just review it. What Metacritic does is they try to assign a number score to that review as close as they can, and then they add that to the average. This isn't as much of an issue for this game and older games, because back in 2002, pretty much everyone gave a direct number review. It's not as common. It's definitely more common for current day reviewers to give just general ideas as opposed to number reviews. But it's something to keep in mind for the future. For this specifically, like I said, the best thing I could do to get general views out to quantify it would be just for numbers. So we'll be using Metacritic for this one. We're only discussing Metroid Prime 1 specifically for this one, Bess. We definitely touch on Metroid Prime 2 and 3 a little bit, but mostly discussing Metroid Prime because this was Metroid's entry into the 3D space. This was their first time doing it. It was also, as we discussed before, it was the first game that was a shooter as well as a platformer. At the same time, first-person shooter and platformer. First-person shooters in general were not very common on console, so this was very, very groundbreaking for tons of different reasons. This was a lot of unexplored territory when it came to gaming. So for the reviews for the actual game, the official reviews, the Metacritic got a 97 out of 100 based on the aggregate scores of all reviewers. This is pretty fucking good. To give this some kind of understanding, it was the highest rated score of any video game in the year 2002. It is tied for the third best reviewed video game of all time on Metacritic. The score of 97 is tied with 12 other games. To understand and put it on the caliber, it's the same score that Super Mario Galaxy 1 got, same as Super Mario Galaxy 2, Breath of the Wild, Halo Combat Evolved, the first one, Mario Odyssey, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Grand Theft Auto 5. I think OOT has a 98, yes. But official critics absolutely loved Metroid Prime. Fantastic rave review scores. The user score was also fantastic. It got a score of 9.2 out of 10. This was tied for first place for the highest user rated score of any GameCube game alongside, I don't think it was GameCube. I think it was a video game. Oh, no, any GameCube game, sorry. Tied with Resident Evil 1 and Resident Evil 4. So the only games that got a 9.2 on Metacritic on the GameCube were Resident Evil 1, Resident Evil 4, and Metroid Prime. And it is tied for fifth place of the highest user score of any Metacritic out of any other game on Metacritic and all. So the score of 9.2 is the fifth highest, and it's tied with 21 other games. And it's tied with certain other games like Super Mario 64, The First Portal, Deus Ex, The Last of Us, Pokemon Heart Gold and Soul Silver, Xenoblade Chronicles, Resident Evil 2, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and Shenmue 2. So this game was extremely well received, just so positive all around, which again, I can't emphasize, so incredibly risky for what they did with the Metroid series, doing what they did, changing it from 2D into 3D, into first person no less, and keeping the shooter and the platforming elements very risky, and they pulled it off with flying colors, with very little to rely on, very little information to draw from, other sources to really draw from when making this game. This game invented the any percent split and 100% split in speedrunning. What? So I do know that Metroid has been known for having, the percentage counter, and it's usually the go-to example when describing speedrunning, any percent, 100%. That's one of the counters that they go to. But how exactly did it invented the term any percent through the community, and it was a split between 80% and 100%. I did not know about this. This did not come up in my research about the history of the game, believe it or not. So was it this game specifically, Metroid Prime, or the Metroid series in general that did this? While you're gathering your response and your information, Prime specifically. Wow, I did not know that. I'm curious to know more about that. We're almost done going through the main content that I have written down and discussed for Metroid Prime itself, and we can talk about all that stuff in a little bit. I really want to know about that. So that was the actual review scores, the number scores that it got. In terms of public reception, the game did very good in the US. People absolutely loved it. When it came to Japan, though, the first three Metroid, it's really weird. The first three Metroid games sold very well in Japan. Once the Prime series came out, it actually sold very poorly in Japan. I've researched and I tried to find an explanation for this, and I couldn't find a concrete answer. There's a lot of different assumed reasons, anecdotal reasons, and this was generally the list that I could find. Japan's disdain for guns in general, so they weren't apparently very prevalent. Games that had a lot of shooting in them weren't really prevalent, and especially FPSs didn't do overly well in Japan. Apparently, Halo, people were already getting Halo fever, sick of Halo at that point, where a lot of different games and shooters coming out at that point were trying to be like Halo. And there's definitely similarities and comparisons to draw between Halo and Metroid Prime. They're both first-person shooters. I mean, yep. Prime is a first-person shooter, technically, but it's not a first-person shooter like a lot of other games. It is a sci-fi type adventure game. You are shooting aliens and things like that, so there is definitely comparisons to be made to it. but I guess the people argued that people were getting sick of Halo, especially in Japan as well. Similar to this was an interesting one that I saw, and I also, this is, again, I just want to say this was the research that I'd done. This is people bringing up anecdotal evidence that I'd seen online. Some of it is very old and dated things. I don't know if any of these reasons can be seen as offensive to even bring up or assume. I apologize if that is the case. This was just something I found very interesting, and I could not find concrete evidence as to why this is. So, similar and comparable to how the Pokemon fan base in Japan has a very strong distaste for James Turner as a Western influence on the design process of Pokemon, apparently there was an established similar feeling with Japan, the Japan market having distrust for Retro being an American-based company working on a Nintendo IP. So they weren't really sold on it and not really interested in getting the game. Another thing, the Japanese market, apparently it's very common for Japanese gamers, or it was, to get dizzy when playing FPS games. They weren't as, again, because FPS games didn't do incredibly well in Japan, most of them didn't play first-person games that like that, and so maybe they would become dizzy upon playing Metroid Prime, and either they did and didn't like it, or they would tell other people, and then other people wouldn't get it as a result. Something that's really interesting that I really want to go into at some point is I want to touch on the differences between JRPGs and Western RPGs. Western RPGs, you think of them like Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy and stuff like that, the Tales of Symphonia games. They have their protagonist is a character. You are just simply controlling that character as they go through the story, and they have personalities that are much more fleshed out. They are determined. They are predetermined in what their personality and what their motivations are like. Whereas in the US, JRPGs are much more blank slates. You have games like Skyrim, Fallout. I'm drawing a blank on Western RPGs right now, but there are other RPGs in the US that are made in the US have much more blank slate characters. They are meant to be characters that don't have a lot of personality. They don't speak. They don't have dialogue. So because they're blank slates, the player can sink into the role of the character. When you're playing a Western RPG, you are playing a character that's in the world of the RPG. When you're playing a JRPG, you're playing a character as the story is happening to them and how they're influencing the story and what that character has to say on the story. When you're playing a Western RPG, you are playing a blank character as you're experiencing a story happening around you. You just happen to be the character there who is in the middle of the story and helping it progress forward. You're not usually saying things with dialogue or having opinions on the matter that's pushing the story forward. You're just a blank slate to slide into and be a part of that world. Samus definitely fills that role, that fills in more into Western RPG type of feel, despite the fact that Samus was always the silent protagonist, and you still have those kinds of things with Zelda, with Link and stuff like that, but because you're the first person view, it emphasizes that even more, that difference between the Western RPG and the JRPG feeling, that it could be possible that Japanese gamers weren't as interested in playing a character like that is much more simple and basic and bland, I guess they could be argued, compared to Japanese games where they have much more personality that people can get invested in the character too. So now I can actually catch up on chat now that, some of the things that was said now that I've gone over that. Back on the oh, that's the speedrun thing. I'll read that in a little bit. On the topic of Halo similar games, I've only ever played the arena mode of the Tribes games, but I wish Tribes was still around. Never even heard of the Tribes games. Metroid has been one of Nintendo's worst selling IPs for a long time, despite how well received the games are. Yes, and it's sold decently in the I talked about this earlier, how when it came out in NES, it was an interesting format kind of change going. I very briefly saw it and I meant to research more on it and I forgot to, but there was like a format kind of change with the Famicom and the NES where the copies that they made were like incompatible with each other, so they had issues with selling the game. So while Metroid sold well, it could have sold a lot better. There was also a similar issue with Super Metroid that I completely forgot about. And then Metroid sold well in the US. It just was also in the GameCube, which didn't sell all that well as a whole. And then all these different things that I've listed could be impacts as to why it sold poorly in Japan, but there's really no clear explanation as to why Metroid itself sold poorly in Japan. But in the grand scheme of things, in terms of sales, it sold 2 million copies. Metroid Prime, the original one, sold 2 million copies. There was 21.74 million GameCube sold, so roughly 1 in 11 owners, people who owned a GameCube, actually have the game. And also we had the trilogy, which was all 3 games that sold together, all 3 games sold as one, that came out on the Wii. That sold another 600,000 copies. Metroid Prime itself on the GameCube was in the top 10 selling games of the GameCube, beating out games like Resident Evil 4, Paper Mario 1000 Year Door, and Pokemon Coliseum. It did well enough that it actually it got sequels. Obviously, it became a trilogy. Shortly after the release of Metroid Prime, it was met with such huge critical and commercial success that Nintendo went straight to Retro and said, do you want to make a sequel? And Retro jumped at the opportunity. And then once Metroid Prime 2 came out, it got the same reception. Didn't sell as well, but still fantastic reception, that they were asked to make a third game. This was supposed to be, the third game was supposed to be the end of the Metroid Prime series, the franchise. Obviously not the end of the IP in general, but the Prime series. But clearly there's a demand for it, because 9 years after the release of Metroid Prime 3, Nintendo announced their Metroid Prime 4 would be in the works. It's possible that they decided to go back to this because of the negative receptions of other Metroid games. So Metroid Prime 4 was announced in 2017, which is crazy. It eventually got scrapped. Unfortunately, it had to start over from scratch. They brought back Retro. They were using God, who was making it? They were the Pac-Man people, I'm pretty sure. Who was making the original Metroid Prime? I can't remember. I'm drawing a blank. But they eventually they said that the game was not meeting the standards that they like. Namco, that's it. Thank you, Bandai Namco. They were working on Metroid Prime 4, and Nintendo said that it was not meeting the standards that they like for their games. So clearly there was some issues in the development process, and they decided to scrap it and part ways and have someone else work on it. So they grabbed Retro, and now Retro is currently working on it. It's still a ways away because they started completely from scratch. Here's hoping that we get something in the near future. But it's probably because of the overwhelming negative reception to other Metroid games that came out after Prime. After Prime, they had, or not after Prime, but they had other games in the series that were released. They had Other M came out, very, very negative reception to that. Federation Forces came out. People were very upset. I think Nintendo was aware that people, Team Ninja definitely had some issues with Other M. That there's an interesting story to that. But I think Nintendo's aware that there's clearly a demand for the Metroid series. I think Nintendo is aware that there is untapped potential in the Metroid series, so they have gone back and decided to go to something that was very well received, go to the Metroid Prime series and continue it from there. Koei Tecmo. Yeah, the whole Team Ninja's backstory seems like a very, very interesting choice for why they decided to have them work on a Metroid Prime game. Seems very, very at war with the type of world and experience that Metroid creates. Yep, Wii U was also without any kind of Metroid games. Metroid has just kind of been on the back burner. After Prime, I think it was because of Metroid's decline in sales in Japan, huge decline in sales in Japan, and still declining sales in the US. They still tried to create something, and it's definitely aimed more at the US market, but they still did not do very well, and they did not have anything really overwhelming, huge game releases. That they've kind of just been trying different things and kind of let it slip into the background, so we haven't got anything huge for Metroid in a while. We had the Metroid 2 remake, which was well received, and goes to show that there is a demand for a Metroid game. So we'll see what we end up getting with Metroid 4. So that's most of the history of Metroid Prime itself that I could really gather. So the only thing really to discuss is that. What can we learn from the release of Metroid Prime? Nintendo shoots Metroid on the chair and then says, "Why would it do horribly?" No, I'm going to go over what we learned from Metroid Prime, and then I'm going to discuss the speedrun stuff. So this is the last topic that I have written down and outlined and stuff like that. So, pretty much now that we've gone through everything, what can we learn from Metroid Prime? What has it taught the industry? What lessons can they learn from it? One of the important things is evolving your games where they need to evolve. Metroid Prime, when they went into 3D, they made the decision to slow down the speed of the experience and the game. They lessened the emphasis on combat. They made it so that there were different challenges, and they presented platforming a different way. These were all, well, at least the combat and the platforming are huge core parts of the Metroid experiences, and they had to dial them back and approach them differently. This can be very scary to do when a game is built on something, but as long as you have the core principle and ideas behind them, as long as you present them a different way, it can work. It was, I'm sure, a very difficult thing to make the platforming much easier. It's more about figuring out how to platform. I'm sure it was very scary to make the combat easier, but more of a puzzle. But these were decisions that had fantastic results and added to the overall experience of the game. Devs should be more understanding and try to figure out what it is about certain elements of the game that is enjoyable, and figure out how they can put it into a new game, a new experience. Because even if you change it, as long as you have the core idea behind it, it can still be fantastic. Exploration over combat. I don't know if I should say exploration over combat, but less emphasis on difficult combat. I talked about it earlier about how most combat situations were turned into a puzzle as opposed to precise aiming and responses. It was one of the first games to get atmospheric storytelling right. Yeah, with the whole the lore system, it's done at the player's pace. And this kind of feeds back into the whole finding the core system, but it's important to find what the purest form of the game makes it great. Reaching into a new genre, taking a series and putting it into a new genre is totally fine. It's just about making sure that you find what about the original game is so fantastic and make sure you transition it over well. And if it can't transition over well, again, making those changes to make it work in that new genre. The expense of one thing to benefit another thing is sometimes a worthwhile trade if done right. Trading combat to allow different obstacles made the experience overall better. I think if they tried to emphasize the shooting combat or the combat in general with the game, I think it would have felt a lot more generic or more frustrating, because they were able to dial back the combat and add different elements of gameplay to it, and emphasis on the exploration made the experience enjoyable overall by far. And this is something that's huge, and God, I really hope Nintendo learns this lesson, because we're seeing it with Warhammer right now, and it's working out really well. Give others a chance. Don't be so overprotective of your IPs that you're not even opening your ideas, the opportunity to different opportunities. Retro was, again, a US-based company, a company that really only had one series, one IP that it had done very well in, but Miyamoto still saw opportunity. He still saw potential in the one game that they were working on. That one game that Miyamoto came and looked when they were working on their 5 games, one of them was the one that stood out. And despite the fact they really had only one series that had a huge, a great track record, Miyamoto still saw potential and said this would work great in the Metroid series. And so they turned it to Metroid Prime, and look what we got out of it. Nintendo did that with Cadence of Hyrule. They took the Zelda one and they gave it to the Necrodancer people. We got Cadence of Hyrule. Fantastic game. They gave it to an indie developer that had really only made one game that had huge critical success or acclaim. Warhammer. If you don't know, a very brief summary of it. Warhammer is a tabletop game, IP, world, universe that was as tabletop games were decreasing in sales and the IP was devaluing and things were going down, they decided, screw it, we're going to take this IP, we're going to chop it up into little bits, they're going to take it and just give it to everyone. Everyone who came knocking at the door asked for a chance to use the Warhammer IP, depending on what the stature, what the track record of that company was. They would give them larger parts, maybe entire worlds, entire cities, major characters, and companies that hadn't really proved themselves, they gave them really minor one-off characters, but they still had the ability to sell it as a Warhammer IP. Because of that, we had so many games that came out that were fantastic. A lot of them not that great. So many great games, though. And all they had to do was just pretty much put the emphasis on the good ones, and it increased the value of the IP. Now the Warhammer is doing fantastic. What was originally going to be a company going under is now doing better than they were before. I understand protecting your IP is important. It is what builds up your reputation and builds your company. But I really hope companies will be more open to the idea of trying something new and trying out different ideas and giving other people an attempt or a crack at some of their IPs, because we have gotten some fantastic stuff out of it. And I really hope Nintendo specifically will do it, because they have so many IPs that don't get a lot of usage. They've been kind of left on the shelf in the background for a while. And maybe Nintendo themselves, they can't think of an idea. By letting another team come in and pitch some ideas and work with it, we could get some more fantastic games like we got Metroid Prime or we got Cadence of Hyrule. God, I hope more developers take that into account. But those are the main lessons that I think that we can learn from Metroid Prime, because it didn't do a whole lot wrong. Like, this is a ton of emphasis on the positives and the good parts of Metroid, but on the game itself. And I like to bring up the negatives and the things they did wrong, but I really can't think of much they did wrong. They did so damn good for this. Does anyone else have any other lessons that they want to bring up that we could possibly learn from Metroid Prime, good or bad? I mean, Other M is the perfect example of that. After 3 US made games, they returned the story to be dedicated to Yoshio Sakamoto, and then Samus Returns was given back to the Western dev, this time Mercury's team from Spain. Yep. That's the thing, like, it's outdated. It's one of those things where, like, this game was very experimental. It was breaking a lot of new ground. First-person shooter on console, that's not breaking new ground, but that's still relatively uncommon at the time. First-person platformer was pretty much unheard of. Combining those two together, extremely unheard of. The standardization of the control scheme for the dual stick layout was something that had really only been established about a year before. So any games that came out, within a year of Halo, they probably couldn't go back and rechange the control schemes because they had so much else based around whatever new control schemes they had set up. Yeah. Metroid Prime, I keep seeing MP1 and thinking Mario Party 1. Atmospheric storytelling, right? Yep, with the whole, it's all in the overworld, but you can read the lore through the scan visor to get extra information. It was all optional. Really well done. I take a 2D Metroidvania map and transition it to 3D is extremely hard. Yep. And they did a fantastic job of that, the way it reconnects to each other, either through shortcuts one way or not one way. God, I want them to hire the guy that made a Metroid 2 remake as a game director. I mean, that's what happened with Sonic Mania. I think that's what it was, Sonic Mania, and it friggin' did fantastic. That's a whole nother thing that we'll talk about when I eventually get to Sonic Mania. First-person platform player, yeah. Yeah, no, when the game came out, the controls were definitely not dated. All right, let's talk about the speedrun thing that you brought up. Okay. Back on SDA, the only way to share runs was by uploading the entire demos. And Metroid Prime changed so much in routes because the only way you knew about new strats was by watching demos. And so the lowest percent you could beat the game and was constantly changing, so the category for beating it as quick as possible became any percent. Meaning you could beat the game with any percentage on the counter. Oh, interesting. And I think that's slightly unrelated, that this means any percent means no requirements and not no restrictions like most people interpret it. Huh. Interesting. So I guess before it was any percent, it was, like 62% and stuff like that. And then as people did more demos, they constantly kept changing it because they kept getting lower and lower percentages. So it just became any percent, huh? Sega is definitely much more willing, but it goes to show that there are good examples of it happening. I really wish that game devs, game companies would be more willing to do that, especially since we're now at the point where a lot of people who grew up with games are at the point where they are passionate about the games. They played the games, they grew up with it. Obviously, it's a different skill entirely to be able to isolate specifically what about a game it is that you like and dislike, but hopefully people who are in game design have that ability to do it. And you would hope that now the people who grew up playing these games and have this ingrained understanding of these games, they are at the point where they can make games. I wish devs would be more willing to let them start creating games. Would only upload demos every month or something, so if someone found a new skip or strat, you wouldn't know about it for weeks at least, huh? That's crazy. When was this? This was probably a long, long time ago. Do you know like a time period for it? Oh, Electric, do you have that one link that you were talking about before? Wow. Oh, Lavathardus. Wow. Wow. There was a lot of work done on this. Holy cow. Well, you know what? No, never mind. That's just Ice Stardust, but just... Okay, that makes sense. Never mind. I mean, that's still a lot of work, but... not as much as I thought. Interesting. Unused Phazon Suit Morph Ball. Interesting. Cool. It looks really sick. I still like the new Phazon Suit, the one that we got by the actual end of the game. Oh, it was just the bug quote. Okay. 2005. Wow, was Skype really not out by then? That's kind of wild. That's cool. I don't know. I think that's most of the discussion that I had written out. I don't really have much else to contribute at this point. Unless someone else has anything else that they want to say. We've gone over the history of Metroid's introduction, its evolution over time. While we got to the time period around Metroid Prime's release, we discussed the games coming out the year before and the year after, both exclusively on Nintendo consoles and not on Nintendo consoles. A brief history on FPSs on console leading up to Metroid Prime. Metroid Prime itself, the game design choices they emphasized as a rubric when designing the game. Changes that they had to make to the Metroid formula to make it in 3D space. The critical reception, the public reception of the games, how it sold, what it led to sequels with, and what we learned, what lessons we and developers could have learned from the Metroid games. That's what we've discussed. That's what I was able to research and get down. Is there anything else anyone wants to bring up to the discussion of the game? I played a game where I felt so alone as Prime and Echoes, incredible immersive world, and no living intelligent NPCs to interact with outside of the one NPC in Echoes. Yep, that one NPC in Echoes. In Echoes, I felt more rewarded by getting to have dialogue conversation with NPC than I did with any of the power-ups. It's really funny, too, because I've actually heard people discuss it where when they interact with the first NPC in Echoes, they just they sighed and they're like, oh no, here we go. They're going to do story and dialogue and blah, blah, blah. And then he became a character that you come back to, and he's the only NPC. He's the only safe space. He's the only person who's on your side on this entire planet where everything else is hostile. And it ended up becoming this thing where people were actually very excited to go back and talk to him, to have these conversations with him, just not only to get the explanation of the story and more information, but also to have another creature, another living thing to talk about. Metroid Prime 3 is by far my least favorite in the series. I am not a huge fan of Metroid Prime 3, to be completely honest. It felt far too linear, and the backtracking to explore different areas didn't feel nearly as natural and organic as it did in the first two games. Metroid Prime 3 was good in different ways, but it's by far my least favorite game. It's still a good game. It's a good experience, but it's definitely it's a disappointing end to the trilogy because you have these two games that are so good. And while I liked one the first 1 the most. 2 was really, really good, but I definitely like 1 more. It was disappointing to see like 1 go like this, and then 2 is like this, and then 3 is like this for me. It was a pretty steep drop down for me. Metroid Prime 3 took a lot of risks, but I think most of them paid off. It changed a lot of what people liked about Metroid. It definitely took away that whole isolation and alone aspect. It made it so if you ever were feeling alone or just that feeling of by yourself, you could just be like, oh, okay, I'll just go back to headquarters, and you're totally fine. You no longer have that presence anymore. You no longer have that stress. Took away a lot of that. It didn't feel like everything was, and because of that, as a result, it didn't feel like everything was out to get you. It didn't have as much of a dark, brooding theme. You have a lot of sense of time of camaraderie where you're fighting alongside other soldiers and trying to save them. It becomes almost like a war mission kind of thing where people are kidnapped and you have to go save them, and that feels good. But again, it's not what I expect from the Metroid series. It's one of those core principles about it that was not in it, and I didn't really enjoy as much. Probably Electric. I've still not played Other M. Areas into planets? Yeah, for sure. And like, I understand that the benefit to separating planets, locations into planets, is that it feels it's much more natural and understanding to have these different biomes entirely. Whereas, like, you know, you have all these different biomes that interconnect with each other. They're all supposedly so close in like Super Metroid and Prime, and they can feel a little weird going from one place immediately to the other. And they're so drastic and different. Having different planets makes it so it makes more sense to go to such different biomes, but it's not worth the trade-off at all, in my opinion. And they definitely did focus a lot on the story, a little too much. I'm totally fine with story in a game, but the way that they approached it in Metroid Prime 1 was fantastic. I don't remember how they approached the story too much in Metroid Prime 2. I want to say every time you went back to talk to the Chozo guy, that explained the story a little bit more, which was great. Which were these little brief segments where you go back and get information by talking to the one friendly NPC in the game. So not only is it a relief to be amongst someone who isn't trying to attack you and kill you, but you also get explanation to the story as well. It makes it so you had that relief, that sigh of relief. The tension is gone, is lifted off of you, but you also get story as well at the same time. So, yeah, the Metroid Prime 3 was still a good game, but it definitely deviated from the Metroid formula in general. The formula, I know they want to make an epic spacefaring odyssey. That's not what Metroid should be, really. And I like, it's definitely a sci-fi game. It's supposed to be a game that's in space, so I can understand why they would want to try to incorporate that more. Like how they had Samus can use her ship to interact with certain things was a really, really cool thing. It was very simplistic, but a great first entry into that idea. But the emphasis on making it so you're traveling through space, not a huge fan of that either. I think that's pretty much it, though. Metroid Prime, such a damn good game. Such a fantastic example of a 2D game transitioning into 3D, making the changes they need to accommodate it, and just knocking it out of the park, especially after having such a long hiatus for a while. But I don't really have much else to add to the situation. I think that's pretty much all I have to say on the subject of Metroid Prime. Absolutely love the game to death. Aged fantastically. And if you haven't played it yet, it is a wonderful first entry into the Metroid series, especially since you can get the Metroid trilogy on the Wii U, on the eShop for $30, and that's all 3 games. With the Wiimote aiming, which sounds really jank, but trust me, it works beautifully. It is so natural. It works wonderfully. So if you've never played a Metroid game, I highly recommend getting into Metroid Prime 1 on the Wii U through the trilogy collection, because while Super Metroid is a great game, it is an older game. It can feel a little bit dated, either graphically or otherwise. It is known to be extremely cryptic at points. I think Metroid Prime is a fantastic first entry into the series. On the future of Metroid outside of Phazon being eradicated and the Psylocke 100% cutscene. So much happened, and at the end, it all didn't really matter. Yeah. I don't really remember much at all about Metroid Prime 3, to be honest. I remembered a lot about Metroid Prime 1 going into it, but now that I've replayed it, it's obviously still fresh in my mind. Metroid Prime 2, I still remember a decent amount about that. Metroid Prime, I remember very, very little, except the harsh change in tone and atmosphere. The idea of the Prime series had to be self-contained, though whether that was a retro decision, we will never know. Nintendo has some very odd decision-making. Like, we have the whole thing where Paper Mario. We just recently found out that that Paper Mario can't create new characters. Sorry, they can only create new characters. They can't take existing characters from the known Mario universe and change them or tweak them or edit them for the Paper Mario series. We don't know if that's a decision by Nintendo or a decision by Retro, but just very odd decisions in general, you know? I would love Salix for Smash. I was saying the exact same thing, Vesper, and I would love that. I think that would be awesome. More Metroid representation would be always welcome. But I think it's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed the discussion for Metroid Prime. Like I said, I've never done anything like this. I've never kind of aggregated this information and taught it as type of a classroom educational type of thing. I've never hosted anything that encouraged discussion, so I hope I did a good job of it. If you have any criticisms or any suggestions, I would love to hear more about it. Anything to help me get better at this, because I don't really plan on stopping. I really want to do more of these. I think they're great. And the next game that I will be doing is Bioshock. I still haven't finished my playthrough of Bug Fables, so I will be doing that. I work tomorrow, Saturday. I'll be back on Sunday with Bug Fables. I expect it'll take me 2 more days to complete Bug Fables, so either Monday or Tuesday, depending on how quickly we beat Bug Fables. I'm expecting to do starting Bioshock, the first original one, on Tuesday, and once we play through that, have the same exact situation we did with Metroid, have the discussion, beat the game, play through it, have a week where I can research the game, kind of gather information that I can, and then have the discussion with you guys, same as we did with Metroid. Is this Goria theme? It might be. It's Metroid Prime Final Boss theme. I don't know if he's called Goria. 235. Metroid Prime Final Boss theme. Obviously, this video, I'm going to take it. I will be uploading it to YouTube. I will even put it into the Twitch uploads. I know everyone, YouTube's pretty much dead. Everyone goes to Twitch uploads at this point, but I plan on making this a series, and am excited to do more of these. Hopefully, I will see you guys in the next one. Hopefully, I will see you guys on stream on Sunday, and hopefully, you'll be there for the what's it called? For the Bioshock discussion. The other thing is, if this right here, this link, has a list to all the games that I have saved and set up on this category list. If you see anything that is, or you'd rather don't see anything that's missing from the list that needs to be added, on the first page there is a submission page, so feel free to submit any other games that I might be missing on there, that I probably am missing, and I will add that to the list if I think it fits as well. I'm planning on doing landmark and influential games. Once we go through a lot of the landmark and influential games, I plan on doing just good games in general, or games that did something in particular spectacularly or very well done. So that's the plan. I don't really know what else to say. You guys are great. Thank you everyone for watching. Thanks for hanging out. I will see you in 2 days, and I hope you enjoyed it, and you'll be here for the next discussion. Have a good night, everyone.